What if the oldest written stories weren't myths at all, but carefully preserved accounts of something witnessed? What if the gods described in Sumerian tablets weren't symbols of nature, but actual beings locked in conflicts so devastating that the memory had to be pressed into clay before it could fade into legend? In the dust-choked ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates once ran clear and cities rose from mud brick into magnificence, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of tablets describing wars in heaven, not metaphors, not poetry. Detailed accounts of battles between the Anunnaki and forces whose names still echo with strange precision through cuneiform wedges carved 5 millennia ago. The texts describe technology that shouldn't exist in Bronze Age mythology, weapons that level mountains, beings who descend from the sky, conflicts that reshape the earth itself. And here's what troubles scholars most. The details are too specific, too technical, too consistent across hundreds of independent tablets to be simple imagination. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that blur the line between myth and survival. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient war stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. The Sumerians didn't write casually. Clay was precious. Each tablet required skill, time, intention. Yet they used that precious material to record what they called the former times, when the Anunnaki walked among humans and fought wars that made the earth tremble. Tonight we'll follow those clay fragments into a story older than history itself. In 1872, a young assistant at the British Museum named George Smith was cataloguing clay fragments shipped from excavations in Mesopotamia when his hands began to shake. The tablet he was translating described a flood that destroyed the world, recorded 1,000 years before Genesis. But it wasn't the flood story that made Smith so agitated he reportedly began removing his clothes in excitement. It was what came before it, a war in heaven, gods fighting gods. Beings called Anunnaki battling forces whose very names seemed to resist translation, as if the Sumerian scribes themselves hadn't quite known what to call them. Smith had been working in the museum's dusty archives for years, surrounded by fragments shipped from Austin Henry Layard's excavations at Nineveh. The British had been pulling tablets from Mesopotamian tells since the 1840s, crating them by the thousands and shipping them to London, where they gathered dust in storage rooms, waiting for someone with the skill and patience to read what hadn't been touched in millennia. Most were administrative records, tax receipts, grain inventories, the mundane bureaucracy of empires that had crumbled into sand. But this tablet was different. This was from the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, who had collected texts from across Mesopotamia in the 7th century BCE, creating perhaps the ancient world's most comprehensive archive. And what Ashurbanipal had chosen to preserve, what he'd considered important enough to copy and protect, were stories, myths, accounts of the time before time, when gods walked the earth and fought wars that shaped the world itself. The specific tablet Smith held that day in 1872 would become known as Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it was embedded in a much larger narrative. The flood was preceded by conflict. The gods, the Anunnaki, had grown weary of humanity's noise and decided to destroy them. But the text described this decision emerging from tension within the divine council itself. Enlil pushing for destruction, Enki resisting. And underneath the theological language, hints of older conflicts, wars between factions of these beings who ruled from the sky. Smith's discovery electrified Victorian England, not just because it predated biblical narrative, but because of what it suggested about the sophistication of ancient record-keeping. These weren't vague myths. They were detailed accounts with genealogies, chronologies, specific locations, and descriptions of events that the ancient scribes clearly believed had actually occurred. Within months, Smith had convinced the Daily Telegraph to fund an expedition to Nineveh to find the missing fragments of the epic. He found them, worked himself to exhaustion in the Mesopotamian heat, and died of fever at the age of 36. Having spent his last years unlocking stories that would force Western civilization to reconsider everything it thought it knew about the ancient world. But it was the tablets, always the tablets, that carried the real weight. And as more excavations followed, as French teams worked at Lagash, and German archaeologists descended on Babylon, and American expeditions pushed into the desert toward Nippur, the tablets multiplied. Thousands became tens of thousands, and among them, scattered across dozens of sites pressed into clay by scribes separated by centuries and hundreds of miles, the same names kept appearing, the same conflicts, the same wars. The word Anunnaki appears in cuneiform texts with a frequency that suggests they weren't minor deities, but central to how the Sumerians understood their own origins. Literally translated, the name means those who from heaven to earth came, though scholars debate whether this is literal or metaphorical. What isn't debatable is that Sumerian king lists, temple inventories, astronomical texts, and epic poems all reference the Anunnaki as beings who established civilization, taught essential skills, and ruled from cities that still lie buried beneath Iraqi sand. They weren't worshipped like gods in other cultures. They were described more like governors, administrators, beings with hierarchy, purpose, and according to certain tablets, enemies. The Anunnaki had structure. They had ranks. Anu was the sky god, the distant authority. Enlil controlled earth and wind, functioning as executive power. Enki, lord of the Abzu, managed wisdom and creation. Beneath them were 50 who descended, sometimes called the Great Anunnaki, and beneath them hundreds more with specific functions, territories, responsibilities. The tablets describe council meetings where these beings debated policy. They describe territorial disputes. They describe succession conflicts and political marriages and treaties, all the mechanisms of governance that human civilizations would later adopt, as if humanity learned statecraft by watching those who came before. But the texts also describe them as vulnerable. They could be killed, though killing them required specific weapons and methods. They could make mistakes. They fought among themselves with a bitterness that suggests genuine stakes, genuine fear. The Atrahasis epic describes the Anunnaki terrified of the flood they themselves had unleashed, huddling together like dogs crouched by an outer wall, trembling at the devastation. These weren't omnipotent deities. They were beings with power beyond human capability, but limitations that made them recognizable, relatable, and according to the war texts, beatable. Imagine holding one of those tablets now, feeling the weight of baked clay in your hands. Running your fingers across wedge-shaped impressions made by a reed stylus pressed into wet mud 5,000 years ago, each mark deliberate, each word chosen. The scribe who made this tablet believed what they were writing was important enough to preserve. They lived in a world where the Anunnaki were spoken of not as distant mythology, but as recent history, the former times. The age when these beings had direct presence in Sumerian cities, when they could be seen, consulted, feared. The scribes worked in temple complexes, in specialized schools called adubas, where young men spent years learning the complicated cuneiform system. 300 signs at minimum to achieve basic literacy, 1,000 or more to master the full range of Sumerian and Akkadian literature. The education was rigorous, expensive, limited to elite families who could afford to spare sons from agricultural labour, and what they were taught, what they spent those years memorising and copying, were the old stories, the king lists, the creation accounts, the war narratives, as if preserving these particular stories was essential to understanding who the Sumerians were and where they came from. And the Anunnaki were always at the centre, described with a consistency across centuries and city-states that suggests either very careful mythological standardization or preservation of historical memory. When Uruk scribes described Anu, they used the same epithets as Nippur scribes 300 years later. When temple inventories listed offerings to Enlil, the formulae remained consistent across the entire geography of Mesopotamia. Either this represents the most successful mythological system in human history, or the Anunnaki were real enough that their characteristics, their hierarchy, their roles couldn't be changed without everyone noticing the deviation from established fact. But here's where the tablets become strange. Among the hundreds of deities in the Sumerian pantheon, certain names appear in conflict narratives with unusual characteristics. The Igigi, described as, quote, 3, who performed labour for the Anunnaki until they rebelled. The Sebiti, 7 warriors of devastating power. The Galu demons, described not as metaphorical evil, but as beings from the underworld with specific abilities and weaknesses. And then there are beings mentioned in fragmentary texts whose names appear only once or twice, in contexts of war, as if the scribes were recording events they themselves didn't fully understand, preserving names of forces involved in conflicts from the former times. The Igigi appear in the earliest creation accounts as numerous divine beings assigned to difficult labour, digging the Tigris and Euphrates, building irrigation systems, performing the exhausting work of terraforming Mesopotamia into habitable land. The Atrahasis describes 40 years of this labour before they break, burning their tools and marching on Enlil's palace in open rebellion. This isn't metaphor. The text describes organised resistance, collective action, demands for justice. The Anunnaki respond by creating humans to take over the work, but the Igigi don't simply disappear from the narrative. Later fragments hint they withdrew, or were expelled, or continued existing in tension with the Anunnaki hierarchy. Then there are the Galu, described in Inanna's Descent to the Underworld as demons who serve Ereshkigal, but with very specific limitations. They cannot be bribed with offerings. They don't eat, don't drink, don't accept sexual favours. They function like automatons, like programmed enforcers with single-minded purpose. When Inanna escapes the underworld, they pursue her with relentless efficiency until finding an acceptable substitute. The text describes them with the same detailed attention given to real enemies, as if the Sumerians needed to remember exactly what the Galu could and couldn't do, in case such knowledge became necessary again. The Sebiti appear primarily in the Erra epic as 7 warriors of such devastating capability that they're described more as weapons than beings. They're not worshipped, they have no cult centres, they exist in the narrative solely to destroy, and their association with plague and lingering death gives them characteristics that feel less like mythology and more like preserved warning. Don't approach, don't touch, the contamination spreads. The kind of warning you'd give about something real, something dangerous that might still be encountered. And scattered through fragmentary tablets are other names, beings mentioned once in battle contexts and never again. The Anzu bird, monstrous and powerful, who steals the tablets of destiny and must be hunted down by Ninurta. The Labu, a creature of the sea that threatens civilization until destroyed by Tishpak. The Asaku, sometimes demon, sometimes mountain, sometimes force of chaos requiring divine intervention to defeat. Each appears in detailed combat narratives with specific tactics, specific weapons, specific outcomes, as if the scribes were documenting actual conflicts against varied opponents, whose nature they understood imperfectly, but whose threat was undeniable. What emerges from these texts is a picture of ancient Mesopotamia as battleground, where multiple factions of powerful beings fought for control, resources, or survival, and where humanity existed in the margins of these conflicts, sometimes as labour force, sometimes as allies, sometimes as collateral damage. The war narratives don't describe simple good versus evil. They describe complex political situations with shifting alliances, betrayals, desperate measures taken by beings facing genuine threat. The Erra epic preserved on tablets from the 8th century BCE but describing events claimed to be far older, tells of a war god named Erra who devastates Babylon with such totality that the text describes weapons making the very ground poisonous. The descriptions are disturbingly specific: heat that doesn't come from fire, contamination that lingers, deaths that manifest slowly after exposure. Modern readers familiar with radiation poisoning have noted the parallels, though whether this represents actual ancient technology, preserved memory of natural disaster, or simply poetic imagination remains viciously debated among scholars. What isn't debated is the precision of the suffering described. Erra isn't presented as evil in the epic. He's exhausted, frustrated, feeling neglected. His weapons have grown rusty, his reputation diminished. The Sabiti, those 7 warriors, encourage him to reassert his power, to remind the world why he was feared. What follows is systematic destruction of Babylon described with geographic specificity. Particular temples are named, specific city gates. The text documents not just the physical devastation, but the social collapse, the breakdown of family bonds, the way father turns against son and brother murders brother in the chaos that follows divine warfare. The descriptions of Erra's weapons resist comfortable metaphor. The text speaks of brilliance that kills without touch, of wind that carries death, of contamination that makes fertile land barren for generations. Shepherds abandon their flocks, farmers flee their fields. The irrigation systems that sustained Mesopotamian civilization break down because the workers are dead or dying, and the deaths themselves are described with clinical detail: skin lesions, hair falling out, internal bleeding. The kind of specific symptomatology that suggests the epic's author either witnessed these deaths or was preserving extremely detailed second-hand accounts. Modern scholars reading the Erra epic divide into camps. Some see elaborate poetic metaphor for plague, for political collapse, for the very real destruction Babylon experienced during various invasions and occupations throughout its history. Others note the descriptions match radiation sickness with uncomfortable precision. The initial flash of light, the latency period before symptoms appear, the progressive deterioration, the contamination of land and water that persists long after the initial attack. Neither explanation is satisfying. Plague doesn't match the complete destruction described. Natural disaster doesn't explain the specific weapon terminology. And accepting the text as description of nuclear warfare in Bronze Age Mesopotamia requires believing something about ancient technology that contradicts everything mainstream archaeology has established. Yet there it is, pressed into clay by scribes who believed they were recording real events. The Erra epic ends with the god himself expressing regret, acknowledging he went too far, that the destruction exceeded what was necessary or justified. Marduk, chief god of Babylon, returns to rebuild. But the memory remains, coded in cuneiform, warning future generations about weapons that could devastate cities and poison earth with heat that doesn't come from fire. And the Erra epic is just one text among hundreds describing divine warfare with similar precision, which leads to questions that archaeology cannot definitively answer. Were Bronze Age poets capable of imagining weapons technology that wouldn't exist for another 4,000 years? Or were they describing something they'd seen, or their ancestors had seen, preserving memory of technology that existed in ages before recorded history and was subsequently lost? Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe weapons wielded by the Anunnaki, with terminology that resists easy translation. The quote 5 that precedes certain gods isn't metaphorical glory, but something that blinds, burns, devastates. The me aren't just divine powers, but objects, transferable and specific, that could be stolen, used, or destroyed. Enki's boat doesn't sail on water in the conventional sense. Ninurta's weapon, the shahua, speaks, flies independently, and strikes with precision. Either these are elaborate metaphors created by Bronze Age poets, Or the Sumerians were trying to describe technology they'd witnessed but lacked vocabulary to explain, falling back on the only reference points they had: divine power. The word quote 7, translated as divine radiance or terrifying splendor, appears throughout cuneiform texts in association with gods and kings. But the context suggests something more tangible than metaphysical presence. The melamu can be worn like a garment. It can be transferred from one being to another. It protects the wearer and terrifies enemies. When Inanna steals the me from Enki, she also takes his melamu, leaving him powerless. When kings claim to possess melamu, they're not speaking poetically. They're asserting they have access to specific power that can be seen, felt, recognized by witnesses. The Epic of Abzu describes this bird demon stealing the quote, _8_ from Enlil, which gives the thief control over the me, the divine decrees. Ninurta hunts Abzu across the sky in a battle described with aerial tactics, pursuing an enemy who can fly, who uses the stolen tablet to deflect conventional weapons. Ninurta must craft a special arrow, one that can pierce the protection of the tablet's power. The battle narrative reads less like mythology and more like technical manual for defeating an airborne enemy with advanced defensive capabilities. Ninurta's weapon, the sharur, is described in the myths with characteristics that defy simple categorization. It speaks, providing tactical advice to its wielder. It scouts independently, flying ahead to assess enemy positions. It transforms between mace and projectile form. It strikes with devastating precision. Modern readers inevitably compare it to a smart weapon, a drone, a missile with guidance systems. Ancient scribes had no such reference points, so they described it as they could. A divine weapon with consciousness and autonomy, loyal to Ninurta but capable of independent action. The quote 9 themselves present an ongoing translation puzzle. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent his career translating Sumerian texts in the mid-20th century, counted over 100 specific me mentioned in various tablets. They include abstract concepts like kingship and justice, but also specific capabilities: metalworking, leatherworking, the art of lovemaking, musical instruments. Particular weapons, specific knowledge sets. They can be listed, counted, transferred, stolen, lost. Inanna steals them from Enki by getting him drunk, then flees in her quote 10 while he sends servants to retrieve what was taken. The boat of heaven itself defies easy interpretation. It flies through the air. It travels between cities instantaneously. It's called a boat but functions more like aircraft. Later texts describe it stored in a temple, maintained by priestesses, treated as sacred object but also practical technology. When Inanna arrives in Uruk with the stolen me, she's celebrated not just for divine power, but for bringing specific capabilities that transform her city's status, as if she's returned from industrial espionage with technological secrets. Enki, lord of the Abzu and master of wisdom, possesses a vessel described with even stranger attributes. It's sometimes called his boat, sometimes his house, sometimes the Abzu itself. It travels underwater. It can surface on the Euphrates or appear in the Persian Gulf. It contains workshops where Enki creates life, engineers species, performs work. The texts describe with vocabulary suggesting biological manipulation. Either this is poetic description of Enki's divine palace in the freshwater realm beneath the earth, or the Sumerians were preserving memory of an actual facility, mobile or stationary, where advanced work occurred away from human observation. The weapons described in battle narratives between gods consistently defy Bronze Age technology. Ninurta fights the Asaku with weapons that shatter mountains. Marduk defeats Tiamat using winds as weapons, net weapons that entangle from distance. A mace that splits her body into pieces that become earth and sky. Nergal descends to the underworld armed with 14 weapons, each named, each with specific function. The lists feel less like mythological inventory, and more like tactical loadout, the kind of detailed specification you'd expect from military texts, not poetry. And then there's the language itself, the way scribes described these weapons when they lacked technical vocabulary. They used approximations. They described effects rather than mechanisms. They fell back on natural phenomena as metaphors. This weapon is like lightning, like storm wind, like flood, like fire from heaven. But the descriptions emphasize these comparisons aren't quite right, that the weapon is like these things, but also different, more powerful, more precise, more terrible than anything natural. Modern translators struggle with these passages because the cuneiform signs themselves resist easy interpretation. A sign might mean brilliance, or radiance, or terrible splendor, or burning light that kills. Context determines translation, but when the context is divine warfare using weapons that shouldn't exist, translators must choose between literal readings that sound like science fiction and poetic readings that reduce everything to metaphor. Neither approach satisfies, because neither fully captures what the ancient scribes seem to be struggling to communicate. That they were describing real weapons, real technology, whose mechanisms they didn't understand but whose effects they documented with precision, born from witnessing or inheriting memory of actual use. The ancient city of Nippur, excavated extensively in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, yielded more cuneiform tablets than any other Mesopotamian site, over 30,000 fragments. Among them, buried in the temple complex dedicated to Enlil, archaeologists found tablets describing conflicts between divine factions with the same bureaucratic detail used for grain records and tax collection. These weren't mythological poems written for entertainment. They were archived in the same administrative sections as historical documents, suggesting the Sumerians themselves considered these accounts factual records of events that shaped their world. Nippur held special status in Sumerian civilization. It was never a political capital, never ruled by dynasties that dominated Mesopotamian politics. Instead, it functioned as a religious center, neutral ground where kings from competing city-states came to legitimize their rule through recognition by Enlil's priesthood. The city's importance lay not in military or economic power, but in its role as keeper of knowledge, preserver of the sacred texts that defined Sumerian identity. When a king conquered territory, when a new dynasty rose, they sent tribute to Nippur. They built at Nippur. They sought the blessing of Enlil's temple because Nippur held the records, the king lists, the narratives that determined who was legitimate and who was pretender. The University of Pennsylvania began excavating Nippur in 1888, returning season after season despite brutal conditions, dysentery, tribal conflicts and heat that made metal tools too hot to touch. They dug through the temple complex, through layer after layer of occupation dating back to the 5th millennium BCE, and found tablets everywhere, in storage rooms, in temple archives, buried in walls as foundation deposits, scattered through residential areas. The sheer volume overwhelmed the expedition. They shipped crates of fragments to Philadelphia, where they sat in museum storage for decades before anyone had time to read them. What emerged as scholars gradually worked through the Nippur tablets was a library of unprecedented scope. Mathematical texts showing sophisticated calculations, medical prescriptions describing treatments for specific ailments, school exercises where students practiced writing, making deliberate mistakes that teachers corrected in the margins, hymns to gods, lamentations for destroyed cities, wisdom literature, legal codes, economic records tracking temple resources across centuries. And among all this, consistently, the war narratives, the conflicts between divine factions, the rebellions, the battles, the catastrophes that shape Sumerian understanding of their own past. The placement of these tablets is what troubles researchers. They weren't segregated in a section for mythology or poetry. They were archived alongside administrative documents, stored with the same care given to economic records and legal precedents. The scribes who organised Nippur's libraries made no distinction between mythological narrative and historical record. A tablet describing Enlil's decree to destroy humanity through flood was filed next to a tablet recording grain distributions. A battle between Ninurta and the Asaku shared shelf space with tax calculations. Either the ancient librarians had no concept of fiction versus fact, or they considered these divine war narratives as factual as any other document in their care, and the texts themselves reinforce this treatment. They include genealogies, chronologies, geographic specificity. They name specific temples, specific cities, specific mountains. They describe the aftermath of conflicts with attention to political and economic consequences. When the flood comes, texts note which cities were destroyed, which survived, how kingship was re-established. When Ninurta defeats the Asaku, texts describe how he redistributed resources, rewarded allies, established new territorial boundaries. These narratives function like historical chronicles, documenting events that had lasting impact on the world the Sumerians inhabited. Later excavations at Nippur, continuing into the 20th century, found even more tablets in areas previously untouched. The scale of the archive suggests generations of scribes dedicated to preservation, copying old texts as they deteriorated, maintaining multiple copies for redundancy, organising and cataloguing with a systematic approach that rivals modern library science. The Sumerians knew knowledge could be lost. Their cities had been destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again. They lived with the constant threat of flood, invasion, political collapse. So they wrote on the most durable material they had, baked clay, and they stored it in the most secure location they knew, the temple of the god who ruled Earth itself. But it was the flood narratives, surfacing again and again in Nippur's archives, that connected everything together. The war tablets made sense when understood as prehistory to the catastrophe that nearly ended civilization. The Anunnaki conflicts weren't random divine squabbles, but escalating tensions that culminated in the decision to wipe the Earth clean and start again. Every ancient Near Eastern culture preserves a flood myth, but the Sumerian version, recorded in the Eridu Genesis and later elaborated in the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes the flood not as divine judgment but as weapon. The gods, specifically the Anunnaki Council, decide to destroy humanity to end a conflict, or perhaps to erase evidence of one. Enki, dissenting, warns Ziusudra to build a boat. But here's the detail that troubles scholars. The flood in these texts isn't described as rain alone. The texts mention the, quote, 15 being opened, the Abzu releasing waters, suggesting catastrophic geological events, tectonic shifts, the kind of worldwide devastation that might result from warfare using forces of nature as weapons. The oldest version, the Eridu Genesis, survives only in fragments. But what remains is explicit. The Anunnaki decide to destroy humanity because their noise disturbs the gods. But the text preceding this decision describes tensions among the Anunnaki themselves, conflicts over territory, resources, the human population that has grown beyond anyone's original intention. The noise complaint reads less like divine irritation and more like final excuse for action already decided. Humanity has become problem, liability, or perhaps witness to conflicts the Anunnaki don't want remembered. The solution is total destruction. But Enki opposes the plan. He warns Ziusudra, later called Utanapishti in Akkadian versions, Atrahasis in others, Noah in Hebrew tradition. The warning is specific. Build a boat to these dimensions, coat it with pitch, bring seed of every living thing, prepare for devastation beyond anything witnessed before. And here's what makes the text remarkable. Enki doesn't warn of rain. He warns that the quote 16 that the Abzu itself will release waters, that fountains of the deep will burst forth alongside heaven's opening. The language suggests something more catastrophic than weather. Modern geologists reading these descriptions note parallels to tsunami, to tectonic events that raise ocean floors and inundate coastlines. The tablets describe water coming from below and above simultaneously, a combination that matches what would occur if massive geological disruption fractured Earth's crust, releasing subterranean waters while atmospheric effects produced unprecedented rainfall. Either this is remarkably accurate poetic description of phenomena the Sumerians never witnessed, or they were preserving memory of actual geological catastrophe so severe it entered every cultural tradition across the ancient Near East. The flood in Sumerian texts lasts 7 days and 7 nights. The boat grounds on a mountain, variously identified as Nizir, as Ararat, as peaks in the Zagros range. Ziusudra emerges, offers sacrifice, and the gods who have been cowering in heaven, terrified by the destruction they unleashed, descend to the offering like flies, desperate and remorseful. The text emphasizes their fear. These aren't omnipotent beings calmly executing judgment. They're portrayed as terrified by what they've done, shocked by the totality of destruction, huddling together for protection against forces they themselves set in motion. Enlil arrives furious that anyone survived. He intended complete erasure, but Enki argues for humanity's preservation, and eventually Enlil accepts, granting Ziusudra immortality and removing him to live at the mouth of the rivers, in the place where the sun rises. Unreachable by ordinary humans, the narrative closes with humanity reduced to a remnant but alive, ready to rebuild civilization from the survivors who received advance warning from the one god who refused to participate in genocide. The implications trouble comfortable readings of ancient mythology. If the flood was weaponed, deployed by divine council vote, with one dissenter who saved humanity by breaking ranks, then we're looking at account of deliberate mass destruction, war crime on geological scale, preserved in humanity's oldest texts. The Sumerians didn't hide this. They featured it centrally in their understanding of why the world was the way it was. The flood separated the former times from the present age. Before flood, gods walked Earth openly. After flood, they remained more distant, and humanity rebuilt with the memory that their existence had once been judged expendable. And threading through every version of the flood narrative is the tension between two brothers. The conflict that defines so much of Mesopotamian mythology, and perhaps explains why divine unity fractured badly enough that genocide became thinkable option. At the heart of many Sumerian conflict narratives lies the tension between two brothers. Enki, god of wisdom, water, and creation, and Enlil, god of wind, authority, and decree. Their conflicts appear throughout cuneiform literature, sometimes philosophical, sometimes territorial, sometimes involving direct action. Enki consistently protects humanity against Enlil's destructive decisions. The flood story, the plague narratives, the Tower of Babel parallels. Each time, Enki intervenes to preserve human life, while Enlil seeks to limit or eliminate it. These aren't simple good versus evil archetypes. The tablets describe complex political conflicts between divine factions with competing interests, territory, and perhaps most intriguingly, competing visions for what humanity should become. The brothers were sons of Anu, the sky god, distant authority who ruled from heaven but rarely intervened directly in earthly affairs. Anu divided responsibility between his sons. Enlil received the earth, the atmosphere, the power to decree and command. Enki received the Abzu, the freshwater realm beneath the earth, wisdom, creativity, the power to create and engineer. The division should have been complementary. Instead, it created rivalry that permeates every text where both appear. Their personalities emerge clearly from cuneiform literature. Enlil is authoritarian, concerned with order, stability, maintaining hierarchy. He values obedience, he punishes transgression. He sees humanity as servants whose purpose is to relieve gods of labor, and when humans become troublesome, he sees no reason to preserve them. Enki is subversive, creative, protective of his creations. He values knowledge, cleverness, life itself. He sees humanity as something worth preserving, teaching, defending even against other gods' decisions. Where Enlil uses power directly, Enki uses cunning. Where Enlil commands, Enki persuades or undermines. The Atrahasis epic makes their conflict explicit. When the Anunnaki tire of humanity's noise and Enlil proposes destruction, Enki objects but is outvoted. The council sends plague. Enki teaches humanity medicine to counter it. The council sends drought. Enki shows humans irrigation. The council sends famine. Enki ensures some survive. Finally, frustrated by Enki's interventions, Enlil proposes the flood, catastrophe so total that even Enki cannot counter it, but Enki finds loophole. He doesn't warn humans directly, which would violate the council's decree. Instead, he speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, and the wall happens to warn Atrahasis, who happens to build a boat and survive. The pattern repeats across dozens of narratives. Humanity faces extinction. Enlil decrees it. Enki subverts it. The brothers never reconcile. They continue through Sumerian literature in permanent opposition, representing two incompatible approaches to governance, to power, to the question of what humanity's role should be. Their conflict isn't resolved because it's fundamental. It's theological, political, territorial, and according to some tablets, personal. Some texts hint at deeper history to their rivalry. Fragments suggest Enki once held higher status, that Enlil's position as Earth's ruler came through political maneuvering rather than the inherent right. Other fragments suggest romantic rivalry, that both desired the same goddess and Enlil won through Anu's favoritism. Still others hint that the division of territory itself was unfair, that Enki received the Abzu as consolation prize when he deserved Earth itself. Whatever the root cause, by the time humans entered the narrative, the brothers were already enemies, and humanity became pawn in their ongoing conflict. But humanity also became reason. Enki created humans, according to most versions, mixing clay with divine blood, engineering creatures capable of labor but also of thought, creativity, potential beyond mere service. Enlil accepted humans as workforce but grew alarmed as they developed culture, technology, independence. The more human civilization advanced, the more Enlil saw threat. The more Enki taught humans, the more Enlil insisted on limitations. Until finally, the only solution Enlil could imagine was erasure, and the only response Enki could accept was preservation at any cost. And so the flood came, weapon deployed in divine civil war, with humanity caught in the middle, saved by one god's defiance and forever marked by the memory that their existence was once debated and nearly ended by beings who claimed authority over life itself. But the flood wasn't the beginning of divine conflicts. The tensions between Anunnaki factions predated humanity entirely, reaching back to the time when the Igigi laboured under Anunnaki rule and finally chose rebellion over continued servitude. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest complete narratives from Mesopotamia, describes a rebellion that scholars often read as metaphor for human labour disputes. But the text is clear. The Igigi were gods, lesser than the Anunnaki, forced to perform exhausting labour-digging channels and building infrastructure. After 40 years of this work, they burn their tools, march to Enlil's palace, and demand relief. The Anunnaki Council responds by creating humans to take over the labour. The Igigi disappear from most subsequent texts, but fragments suggest they didn't simply accept this solution. Later texts hint at conflicts between Igigi factions and the Anunnaki that may have continued for generations. The Atrahasis opens with the world divided among gods after some previous conflict the text doesn't detail. Anu rules heaven, Enlil rules earth, Enki rules the Abzu, and beneath them the Igigi, described as numerous enough to form workforce strong enough to be useful, but powerless enough to be commanded. Their task is terraforming, making Mesopotamia habitable, digging the Tigris and Euphrates rivers from source to sea, dredging irrigation channels, clearing land, building temples, the back-breaking labour of creating civilization's foundation. The text describes their work with specificity that suggests real engineering projects. They carry earth baskets, they dig with tools that break from use, they work in shifts through day and night. 40 years pass. 40 years of exhausting labour while the Anunnaki supervise from cities, enjoying the fruits of work they don't perform, and then the Igigi break. The text says they burned their tools, a detail so specific it suggests real rebellion tactics, the destruction of equipment a statement that labour will no longer continue. They march to Enlil's dwelling at night, surrounding it, demanding his attention. Enlil wakes to find his palace surrounded by hostile gods, and his first response is fear. He sends for Anu and Enki, calling emergency council of the great Anunnaki. The question becomes how to respond to rebellion by beings powerful enough to pose genuine threat, but numerous enough that violent suppression would be costly. The Anunnaki debate options. Some suggest punishment. Others note the Igigi's complaints are legitimate. The work is exhausting. 40 years is too long. Enki proposes solution. Creates substitute workforce. Beings capable of labour but weak enough to be controlled. Humanity. The text describes the creation process with disturbing detail. A god is slaughtered, Ila, specifically chosen, though the text doesn't explain why. His blood is mixed with clay. The goddess Nintu, also called Mami or Belit Ili, shapes 14 forms, 7 male, 7 female. The mixture is left for specified time, and when the incubation completes, humans emerge, capable of thought and labour, ready to replace the Igigi in the exhausting work of maintaining civilization. The Igigi presumably accept this solution and withdraw from the narrative. Most texts stop mentioning them after humans take over the labour, but fragments from various sites hint at continued tension. Some describe Igigi dwelling in heavens separate from Earth, as if they rejected any role in human management. Others mention Igigi in underworld contexts, suggesting factional split, some aligned with Ereshkigal's realm rather than the surface Anunnaki. Still others hint at Igigi involvement in later conflicts, fighting on various sides in wars between Anunnaki factions. One fragment, discovered at Sippar and still not fully translated, describes quote 19 and mentions their alliance with forces opposing Enlil's authority. Another text from Uruk's temple archives mentions Igigi quote 20 quote. In the context of some conflict involving irrigation rights and territorial control, the references are maddeningly vague, but they suggest the Igigi didn't simply disappear or accept their replacement. Some remained involved, some bore grudges, some saw opportunities in the conflicts that followed. The timing matters too. If the Igigi rebellion occurred before humanity's creation, and if humanity was created specifically to replace them, then human existence from the beginning was a compromise solution to divine labour dispute. Humans weren't created for their own sake, but as tools, intermediate beings who could think well enough to perform complex tasks but not well enough to rebel effectively. The existential bleakness of this origin story didn't escape Sumerian thinkers, who reflected on it in wisdom literature asking why gods created beings who suffer, age, die, knowing only labour and brief pleasure before returning to dust. But the Igigi story also establishes pattern. Lesser beings rebelling against greater, demanding justice, forcing the powerful to adjust rather than simply crushing resistance. The precedent mattered when later conflicts erupted. When humans or other factions challenged Anunnaki authority, because the Igigi rebellion proved that even gods could be made to negotiate, and some conflicts required more than negotiation. Some required warfare on scale that threatened cosmic order itself. Battles between Anunnaki and forces that even the texts struggle to categorize or explain. The myth of Ninurta and the Asaku describes a warrior god fighting an enemy so terrible it threatened the cosmic order itself. The Asaku isn't a single being, but a force, sometimes described as demon, sometimes as mountain, sometimes as collection of hostile entities. Ninurta's battle spans both earth and heaven, and the text describes weapons, tactics, and destruction, with military precision uncommon in mythology. Mountains are shattered. The landscape is permanently altered. The defeated Asaku are transformed into stone, their bodies becoming the mountain ranges of the Zagros. Either this is metaphor for geological formation, or the Sumerians were preserving memory of a conflict that literally reshaped Mesopotamia's geography. The narrative begins with disturbance from the mountains. The Asaku rises, threatening the fertile plains where civilization exists. The exact nature of the Asaku remains ambiguous even in the source texts. Sometimes it's singular, the Asaku, treated as unified threat. Sometimes plural, the Asaku demons, described as numerous hostile entities. Sometimes it's associated with mountains themselves, as if geography has become animate, hostile, actively opposing civilization's existence. Ninurta, son of Enlil, warrior god and champion of the Anunnaki, responds to the threat. But the text emphasizes this isn't simple confrontation. Ninurta prepares carefully. He gathers specific weapons, 14 of them, each named, each with particular function. He consults with his divine weapon, the Sharur, which scouts ahead and reports enemy positions, capabilities, weaknesses. The preparation reads like military planning, reconnaissance, strategic assessment before engagement. The battle itself spans enormous geography. Ninurta fights the Asaku across mountains and sky. The text describes aerial combat, pursuit through clouds, engagement at altitudes where normal beings cannot breathe. The Sharur flies independently, striking targets Ninurta indicates. Other weapons are deployed in sequence, each designed to counter specific Asaku capabilities. The battle isn't concluded in single engagement, but requires sustained campaign, multiple assaults, gradual wearing down of enemy that regenerates or retreats and must be pursued. The destruction is geological in scale. Mountains are split, valleys are formed, rock is shattered and scattered across plains. When Ninurta finally defeats the Asaku, the text describes their bodies transformed to stone, becoming the mountain ranges themselves, as if the enemy's physical form was so substantial that its remnants permanently altered landscape. The Zagros Mountains, which form the boundary between Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, are explicitly named as the defeated Asaku, their peaks the visible reminder of battle between god and force that threatened world stability. After victory, Ninurta reorganizes the defeated materials. Some stones he blesses, making them useful for tools, construction, healing. Others he curses, making them dangerous, poisonous, unsuitable for human contact. The systematic categorization suggests the aftermath of the battle left Mesopotamia with new mineral resources, some beneficial, some hazardous, all requiring knowledge to identify and handle properly. Either this is mythological explanation for geological diversity, or it's preserving memory of actual aftermath, when battleground had to be assessed for safety and utility. The text concludes with Ninurta celebrated, receiving honours from the Anunnaki Council, being granted increased authority as proven defender of cosmic order, but the narrative emphasises cost. The battle nearly failed. The Asaku came close to overwhelming Ninurta's forces. Only superior weapons, tactical flexibility, and perhaps divine intervention from Ea, who provided crucial advice at key moment, ensured victory. The sense emerges of narrow success against terrible odds, threat barely contained, enemy that could return if vigilance lapses. And here's what troubles modern readers: the detail, the precision, the specific naming of weapons, tactics, geographic features. This doesn't read like imaginative poetry. It reads like chronicle, like after-action report, like historical document recording significant military campaign whose outcome shaped the world. Either Bronze Age poets had remarkably sophisticated imagination and interest in military detail, or they were preserving through mythological framework memory of actual conflict whose scale and consequences couldn't be forgotten. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic, describes the universe born from divine conflict. Tiamat, primordial goddess of salt water, wages war against the younger gods led by Marduk. But the battle described in these 7 tablets isn't metaphorical. Marduk uses wind weapons, net weapons, weapons that split Tiamat's body to create sky and earth. He assigns defeated gods to new roles. He establishes order through military victory. The text parallels the Anunnaki conflict narratives, suggesting either the same event told from different perspectives, or a pattern of divine warfare that characterized Mesopotamian prehistory according to those who lived closest to it. The Enuma Elish was recited annually during Babylon's New Year festival, performed in Marduk's temple before assembled crowds who treated these words not as entertainment but as foundational truth. The 7 tablets discovered in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh preserve what Babylonian culture considered essential knowledge about cosmic origins, and those origins are violent, chaotic, born from war between primordial forces and the younger gods who ultimately established order. Tiamat represents the salt sea, Abzu the fresh water. Together they are parents of the first generation of gods, who produce offspring, who produce more offspring, filling the cosmos with divine beings whose noise and activity disturb Abzu's rest. Abzu decides to destroy them. Tiamat initially resists but is persuaded. The younger gods learn of the plot. Ea, called Enki in Sumerian texts, uses magic to kill Abzu before he can act. Tiamat, enraged by her consort's murder and pressured by other primordial beings, prepares for war. The text describes Tiamat's preparations with military precision. She creates 11 types of monsters, dragon-like creatures, serpent beings, storm demons, creatures whose very descriptions resist translation because the Akkadian terms have no modern equivalent. She appoints King as commander, gives him the Tablet of Destinies, which grants authority over the Amir, the divine powers. She assembles an army that the younger gods, despite their cleverness and power, cannot face with confidence. The Anunnaki Council meets in panic. Various gods are proposed as champion. Each refuses. The enemy is too powerful. Tiamat's forces too numerous. King's possession of the Tablet of Destinies gives him control over fate itself. Until Marduk, son of Ea, steps forward with conditions. He'll fight Tiamat, but if he wins, he demands supreme authority over the Anunnaki. He wants to be chief god, highest authority, with power to decree fate. The council, desperate, agrees. Marduk's preparation for battle reads like military briefing. He assembles specific weapons, bow and arrow, mace, net, winds captured and weaponized, lightning, a storm cloud he rides like vehicle. The text describes his armor, his strategy, his tactical approach. He advances alone toward Tiamat, challenges her to single combat. When they engage, it's not mystical confrontation, but battle using physical weapons with devastating effects. Marduk traps Tiamat in a net. He releases winds that enter her mouth when she roars, inflating her body from within. He shoots an arrow through her swollen form, piercing her heart. With Tiamat dead, he confronts her army, captures them, takes the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu. Then comes the act that modern readers struggle to categorize as mythology or something stranger. Marduk splits Tiamat's body in half, using one part to create sky, the other to create earth. He arranges her internal organs as cosmic features. Her eyes become sources of the Tigris and Euphrates. Her breasts become mountains. Her tail forms the Milky Way. Either this is poetic description of cosmic formation through metaphor of defeated enemy transformed into world, or the text is preserving memory of the event so catastrophic that survivors could only understand it as divine warfare. The parallel to other Anunnaki war narratives is striking. Each describes military conflict that ends with defeated forces transformed, integrated into new order, their very substance repurposed. Ninurta transforms the Asaku into mountains. Marduk transforms Tiamat into earth and sky. The pattern suggests template. Either mythological formula or consistent method by which victorious Anunnaki factions dealt with defeated enemies. After victory, Marduk reorganizes the cosmos. He assigns defeated gods to various roles. Some become gatekeepers, others maintain cosmic functions, some are imprisoned. The text describes systematic restructuring of divine hierarchy based on loyalty during the war. Those who sided with Marduk receive rewards. Those who fought for Tiamat face punishment or forced servitude. It's political settlement after military victory, treaty imposed by victor on defeated factions. But Marduk also creates humanity. The text describes the decision emerging from practical need. The gods are exhausted from the war, from maintaining cosmic order. They need relief. So Marduk proposes creating humans from the blood of Kingu, the defeated commander, mixing it with clay. The humans will serve the gods, perform labour, offer worship. This mirrors the Atrahasis account, where humans replace the Igigi, but here humanity is specifically created from the blood of defeated enemy, as if the Babylonians understood their own origin as tied to divine warfare, their very substance derived from the losing side. The Enuma Elish concludes with Marduk enthroned, granted 50 names representing his complete authority, and humanity serving the gods who established order through violence. Its creation myth as military history, universe as trophy of successful rebellion against primordial forces, and its annual recitation suggests the Babylonians wanted to remember that their world, their civilization, their very existence emerged from catastrophic conflict resolved by warrior god who literally split the enemy's body to make the earth beneath their feet. The threads connecting Enuma Elish to Anunnaki war narratives are numerous. Tiamat's army includes beings mentioned in other conflict texts. The Tablet of Destinies appears repeatedly as object of warfare. The restructuring of divine hierarchy after victory matches patterns in Sumerian king lists. Either Babylon was elaborating older Sumerian traditions into systematic theology, or both were preserving different aspects of the same catastrophic period when gods warred and Earth itself was battlefield. But the focus on the Tablet of Destinies, on control of the me, suggests something specific was at stake in these divine wars beyond mere territory or status. Something tangible. Something that granted genuine power to whoever possessed it. Throughout Sumerian literature appears reference to the quote, 21 often translated as divine decrees or powers, but described in texts as objects. Physical things that could be stolen, transferred, or destroyed. When Inanna travels to Eridu and gets Enki drunk, she steals the me and carries them to her own city of Uruk. The me include kingship, warfare, metalworking, writing, sexual practices, specific technologies. They're not abstract concepts, but tangible items with specific functions. Some scholars suggest these represent actual technological artifacts that Sumerian culture remembered but no longer understood, preserved in mythology as divine objects, because the actual nature had been forgotten over centuries. The story of Inanna and the me provides clearest description of what these objects were and how they functioned. Inanna, ambitious goddess of Uruk, travels to Eridu, Enki's city where the me are kept. She visits Enki in his Abzu sanctuary. He welcomes her with a feast. They drink beer, lots of beer, and as Enki becomes progressively intoxicated, Inanna asks for the me. In his drunken generosity, Enki gives her over 100 specific me, which the text lists systematically. The list is remarkable for its specificity and range. The me include abstract powers like kingship, priesthood, divinity, but also concrete skills and technologies, the art of metalworking, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, the craft of the reed worker. They include musical instruments, specific types of wood, sacred prostitution, law, falsehood, art, cult prostitution, music, eldership, heroship, power, enmity, straightforwardness, the destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing, truth, the rebel lands, goodness, justice. Over 100 items, each apparently distinct. Each transferable, Inanna loads these me onto her _quote, _22_ and flees toward Uruk. Enki sobers up, realizes what he's given away, and sends servants to retrieve them. The text describes pursuit across the landscape, Enki's messengers catching up to Inanna at various way stations along the journey. Each time they demand return of the me. Each time Inanna's servant Ninshubur argues they were given freely and cannot be reclaimed. Each time Inanna escapes and continues toward Uruk. When she arrives in Uruk with the me, she's celebrated as having transformed the city's status. Uruk gains capabilities it didn't have before. Technologies, social structures, religious practices, cultural sophistications. The me aren't just symbolic authority, but actual functional capacity. Having them means being able to do things, create things, organise society in ways impossible without them. Other texts describe me being lost, stolen, contested. The Tablet of Destinies, which appears in multiple war narratives, seems to be either collection of me or device that controls them. King wears it in battle. The Anzu bird steals it. Marduk claims it after defeating Tiamat. Whoever possesses the Tablet of Destinies can decree fate, meaning they have authority over the Ami, over the divine powers that structure reality. Modern scholars debate what this represents. The traditional interpretation treats me as abstract concept of divine decree, cosmic principles that gods embody and distribute. But the texts consistently describe them as things. Physical objects that can be loaded onto boats, items that can be inventoried, listed, counted. Technologies and skills that can be transferred wholesale from one location to another, transforming recipient cities' capabilities overnight. Some researchers propose the me represent knowledge, cultural practices, technical expertise that could be transmitted through teaching, trade, or conquest. A city gaining the me of metalworking means acquiring the knowledge, tools, and social organisation necessary for bronze production. A city gaining the me of kingship means adopting political structures, legitimacy principles, administrative systems that define proper governance. But other researchers note the texts describe me with characteristics suggesting something more tangible than knowledge. They're protected. They're stored in specific locations. They require containers for transport. They can function independently, as when weapons described as me operate autonomously. Either the Sumerians used physical object language for abstract concepts with consistency that seems deliberate, or they actually were describing artifacts, devices, tools whose function they understood, but whose nature they couldn't fully explain in Bronze Age vocabulary. The possibility that me were actual technology, preserved from earlier civilization or provided by the Anunnaki, appears repeatedly in alternative archaeology. If Sumerian culture remembered civilization not as slow development, but as sudden gift, as knowledge and capability provided by beings from elsewhere, then describing that knowledge as me, as divine objects transferred from gods to humans, makes perfect sense. The me become repository of everything that made Sumer suddenly advanced. Agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, complex social organisation, all arriving together, fully formed, attributed to Anunnaki who brought them from heaven. Mainstream archaeology rejects this interpretation, noting that evidence shows gradual development of Sumerian culture from Ubaid period through Uruk period into early dynastic. But the Sumerians themselves insisted civilization came as gift, sudden and complete from beings who possessed it already. Their own texts, their own cultural memory, preserved this interpretation with remarkable consistency. And consistently, those texts located the source of the me in Enki's domain, in the Abzu, the mysterious realm beneath the earth where creation occurred and knowledge was stored. Enki's domain, the Abzu, is described in cuneiform texts with architectural specificity unusual for mythological locations. It's beneath the earth but accessible through water. It contains workshops where creation occurs. It's protected by barriers that only certain beings can cross. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions Utanapishti being taken to live at the mouth of the rivers after surviving the flood, in a place unreachable by normal humans. Either the Abzu is metaphor for groundwater and aquifers, or Sumerian texts are describing an actual facility, perhaps subterranean, perhaps underwater, where certain Anunnaki conducted work separate from the surface world where humans lived. The word Abzu itself is compound, Ab meaning water, sea or father, and Zu meaning deep or distant. Together the deep water, the distant sea, the primordial depths. It appears throughout Sumerian texts as Enki's exclusive domain, place where he dwells and performs creative work. But the descriptions resist simple categorization as mythological underworld or symbolic space. The Abzu is accessible. Inanna travels there to visit Enki and steal the me. Other gods visit for consultations. Humans occasionally reach it, like Adapa, the sage who gains wisdom there but offends Anu. The journey is difficult but not impossible, suggesting the Abzu isn't afterlife realm but actual location, protected and remote but physically reachable by those who know the way. The Abzu contains specific features, workshops where Enki creates life forms, engineers species, designs humans, storage areas where the me are kept, meeting chambers where Enki receives visitors, defensive barriers that prevent unauthorized entry, described sometimes as magic, sometimes as 7 gates requiring passwords, sometimes as waters that kill those who touch them without protection. The architectural detail suggests real facility with security measures, functional spaces, organized layout. The Epic of Gilgamesh adds intriguing detail. After the flood, Utanapishti is granted immortality and taken to live at the mouth of the rivers in the land of the rising sun, where Gilgamesh must travel to seek wisdom about death. The location is beyond normal geography, requiring journey through mountain passes guarded by scorpion beings, across waters of death that dissolve flesh. When Gilgamesh arrives, he finds Utanapishti living in a place that seems separate from normal world, unreachable by accident, maintained by gods for specific purpose. The description parallels the Abzu, remote, protected, accessible only to those granted permission. Utanapishti's home might be the Abzu itself, or extension of it, a place where flood survivor was taken specifically because it exists outside normal human geography. The text emphasizes permanence of the location. Utanapishti will live there forever, unchanging, like the place itself is unchanging, preserved from the time before flood. Some scholars interpret the Abzu as literary device, symbolic of chaos waters that existed before creation, complementing Tiamat's salt water with Apsu's fresh water, both representing primordial state before cosmic order. But Sumerian texts don't treat it symbolically. They describe it practically, functionally, as location with specific purpose, where specific activities occur. Alternative interpretations suggest the Abzu might be actual subterranean facility, possibly built into aquifer systems beneath Mesopotamia, accessible through wells or springs at specific sacred sites. The Sumerians were hydraulic engineers. They understood groundwater, aquifers, how water moved beneath the earth. If the Anunnaki or some earlier civilization built facility tapping into these water systems, using them for cooling, power, or concealment, the Sumerians would describe it as Abzu, as the deep waters, because that's what surrounded and protected it. More speculative interpretations propose the Abzu as underwater facility, possibly in the Persian Gulf, which was dry land during Ice Age sea level lows and flooded as ice melted. If advanced facility existed in the Gulf basin before flooding, it might remain functional underwater, accessible to those with technology to reach it. The Sumerians, lacking such technology, would preserve it in mythology as unreachable realm where gods dwell, where Enki performs mysterious work, where the me are stored safe from human interference. What all interpretations share is acknowledgement that the Abzu, whatever it was, remained important to Sumerian understanding of their world. Enki's power derived from controlling the Abzu. The me was stored there, creation occurred there, and consistently the Abzu is described as defense, as refuge, as place Enki could retreat when conflicts with other Anunnaki became dangerous. It was his fortress, his laboratory, his archive, protected by its very inaccessibility. And in times of war, as the Erra epic demonstrates, certain gods could call upon forces so devastating they required even war gods to pause before deploying them. The Erra epic introduces the Sabiti, 7 warriors of such power that even Erra the war god must seek their assistance for his planned destruction. They aren't described as gods in the traditional sense, but as weapons, or perhaps beings who function as weapons. Their attributes remain mysterious because the text describes them primarily through their effects. Wherever they march, civilization falls. They're associated with plague, with poison, with forms of destruction that persist after they've passed. Some fragments suggest they were created specifically for war, engineered rather than born. Though whether by Anunnaki science or divine power, the texts leave deliberately ambiguous. Erra, god of war and plague, grows frustrated with peace. His weapons rust unused, his reputation fades, his temple receives fewer offerings. The Sabiti visit him, encouraging him to reassert his power, to remind the world why he is feared. They describe themselves as weapons of Anu, created in heaven, tempered in earth's foundations, designed for specific purpose. The destruction of cities and the killing of populations. The text is explicit about their nature. They're not born from divine parents like other gods. They're manufactured, created, forged, in some process that the text describes with terminology, usually reserved for making weapons or tools. They exist to destroy. They have no other function, no other attributes. They're perfect killers, and they encourage Erra to employ them against Babylon, which has grown too prosperous, too proud, too secure in Marduk's protection. Erra hesitates, not from mercy but from calculation. Marduk is powerful. Moving against Babylon risks direct confrontation with the chief god. But the Sabiti persuade him that Marduk has left Babylon, travelling to some distant location to clean his royal garments, which have become soiled with the pollution of earth. In Marduk's absence, Babylon is vulnerable. Erra and the Sabiti enter the city. The destruction that follows is described with disturbing precision. The Sabiti move through Babylon methodically. They strike temples, administrative centres, residential areas. The text describes specific symptoms in the victims: fever, lesions, bleeding, progressive weakness. Families turn against each other. Social order collapses. The irrigation systems fail as workers die or flee. Livestock wander abandoned. Fields go unplanted. And underlying all this is contamination. The land itself becoming poisonous, dangerous to touch, dangerous to inhabit. The descriptions have led some researchers to propose that the Sabiti represent preserved memory of biological or chemical weapons. The 7 warriors might be 7 plagues. 7 forms of contamination, 7 types of agents designed to destroy populations without conventional warfare. The emphasis on lingering effects, on contamination that persists after the Sabiti have passed, matches what would occur with weapons designed to remain deadly long after deployment. Others note the Sabiti's association with specific astronomical phenomena. In some texts, They're connected with the Pleiades, 7 stars visible in night sky. In others, they're associated with comets or meteors. The connection suggests the Sabiti might represent celestial threat, objects from space that impact Earth with devastating consequences. Ancient cultures worldwide preserved memories of catastrophic impacts in mythology. The Sabiti might be Mesopotamian version, 7 impact events or celestial bodies that caused widespread destruction. But the texts also describe the Sabiti as controllable, as weapons that Erra can direct, deploy, command. They follow orders, they target specific locations, they can be recalled when their work is complete. This suggests agency, intention, designed function rather than natural disaster. Either the mythology anthropomorphizes natural phenomena into obedient weapons, or the Sabiti were actually controllable force, technology, or engineered beings that could be deployed strategically. The Erra epic concludes with the god acknowledging he went too far, that Babylon's destruction exceeded what was justified. Marduk returns, finds his city devastated, and tension between the gods remains unresolved. But the Sabiti themselves retreat into mythology, mentioned only rarely in later texts, always with fear, always in context suggesting their last resort, weapons too terrible to deploy except in direst need. Their presence in the epic reveals something troubling about Anunnaki warfare. Existence of forces so destructive that even gods hesitated to use them, weapons that could end civilizations, leave landscapes poisoned, cause suffering that lasted generations. Whether metaphor, memory, or historical record, the Sabiti represent acknowledgement that divine conflicts could escalate beyond control, that the Anunnaki possessed or could create forces whose deployment would fundamentally change the world. And perhaps nothing symbolizes the intersection of earth and heaven, the connection between Anunnaki and humanity, more than the massive structures the Sumerians built specifically as bonds between realms. The ziggurat of Babylon, called Etemenanki, meaning Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, stood over 90 meters tall when completed. But Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe its predecessor structures not as temples alone, but as bond between heaven and earth, suggesting function beyond worship. The biblical Tower of Babel story, likely derived from Mesopotamian sources, describes humans building a tower to reach heaven, which God destroys, scattering humanity. But earlier cuneiform texts suggest these massive structures had specific purposes related to Anunnaki presence on Earth, perhaps landing platforms, perhaps communication arrays, perhaps literal bonds between earthly and celestial realms that certain factions wanted maintained and others wanted severed. Ziggurats were not pyramids, not tombs, not solid monuments. They were stepped towers with temple structures on top, accessed by staircases and ramps, designed as artificial mountains rising from Mesopotamian plains. Each major city had one, dedicated to the city's patron deity. Uruk had the ziggurat of Anu, Nippur had Enlil's, Ur had Nanna's, and Babylon had Etemenanki, Marduk's temple tower that became most famous of all. The construction of Etemenanki represented massive investment. The base covered area of 91 meters square. 7 levels rose to height of roughly 91 meters, creating structure visible across the entire Mesopotamian plain. The top level held temple chamber, small room of blue glazed bricks where only priests entered, where Marduk supposedly descended to meet with his priesthood during specific rituals. Herodotus, visiting Babylon in the 5th century BCE, described the tower and reported that the topmost chamber contained large couch and golden table, but no cult statue, as if the space was meant for actual habitation, not just symbolic presence. But earlier Sumerian texts describing ziggurats use terminology that suggests specific function beyond religious symbolism. They're called, quote 28, quote 29, quote 30, quote 31. The Epic of Inanna describes a shepherd king who ascends to heaven on the back of an eagle to retrieve a plant of birth, and the journey begins at a ziggurat. A as if these structures were specifically constructed as access points between realms. The biblical Tower of Babel story, recorded in Genesis but likely deriving from much older Mesopotamian traditions, describes humans building tower to reach heaven. God descends, sees the tower and says, quote 32, "He scatters humanity, confusing their language so they cannot cooperate on such projects again." The story is typically read as parable about human pride and divine punishment, but examined closely, it suggests something more specific. Humans were attempting to access divine realm, and this was perceived as genuine threat requiring intervention. Sumerian texts describing the original construction of ziggurats emphasize they were built to specifications provided by gods themselves. The dimensions are precise, the orientation is exact, the materials are specified. It's not human architecture adapting to divine worship, but divine engineering implemented by human labour. The gods wanted these structures built to particular standards for particular purposes. Some researchers propose ziggurats functioned as landing platforms for Anunnaki vehicles, the boats of heaven described in texts. The flat tops, the elevated positions, the precise dimensions all support this interpretation. If the Anunnaki arrived in vehicles that required cleared space for landing, elevated platforms away from population centres would be practical necessity. Building them as temple complexes would ensure protection, maintenance, restricted access. Others suggest ziggurats were communication devices, constructed to amplify signals or focus energy for transmissions between earth and sky. The use of specific materials, particular geometries, exact orientations might create resonance patterns useful for technology the Sumerians couldn't understand but faithfully reproduced according to divine instruction. The topmost chambers, small and restrictive, might house equipment rather than provide space for worship, equipment maintained by priesthood who understood operation but not principle. Still, others propose ziggurats were symbolic only. Built by humans attempting to reach gods who had withdrawn, monuments to lost connection rather than functional technology. The Babel story would then represent recognition that this effort failed, that humans could build a heaven but found it empty, that the gods, the Anunnaki, had departed, leaving behind only memory and abandoned infrastructure. What all interpretations acknowledge is that ziggurats represented something essential to Mesopotamian civilization's relationship with its gods. Enormous resources were devoted to building and maintaining them. Cities without ziggurats were considered incomplete. Kings demonstrated piety and power through ziggurat construction or renovation. And consistently, the texts describe these structures as bonds, connections, points where earthly realm touched divine, where humans could approach gods or gods could descend to earth. The destruction of ziggurats, when it occurred through warfare or natural disaster, was treated as cosmic catastrophe. Lamentations were written, preserved, performed. The breaking of the bond between heaven and earth was existential threat, suggesting civilization survival depended on maintaining these connections. Either the Mesopotamians were extraordinarily committed to purely symbolic architecture, or the ziggurats served functions that made them actually essential. Infrastructure whose loss would fundamentally alter the relationship between humanity and the powers that shape their world. Sumerian texts reference the Kur with unusual consistency. It's translated as underworld, as mountain, as foreign land, but the context shifts depending on which conflict is being described. Inanna descends to the Kur and dies there. Ninurta battles the Asaku in the Kur. Gilgamesh seeks immortality beyond the Kur. Some tablets suggest it's a physical location, a mountain range, possibly the Zagros, where defeated gods were imprisoned or where certain Anunnaki withdrew after conflicts with their kin. The Kur appears to function as both prison and refuge, a place between worlds where normal rules don't apply and beings from the former times still linger. The word Kur appears in Sumerian texts with frustrating ambiguity. In some contexts, it clearly means foreign land, the mountain regions beyond Mesopotamian plains where different peoples lived and different languages were spoken. In other contexts, it means underworld, realm of the dead ruled by Ereshkigal, sister of Inanna, where souls go after death. But in still other contexts, particularly in war narratives and divine conflict texts, Ker seems to reference specific location, a place with geographic reality that exists between or beyond normal categories. When Inanna descends to the Kur in one of Sumerian literature's most famous poems, she travels to her sister's realm, passing through 7 gates, surrendering her divine power at each threshold until she arrives naked and powerless before Ereshkigal's throne. The journey is described with geographic specificity. Inanna travels downward, through passages, past guardians, into territory hostile to her authority. She dies there, her corpse hung on a hook, and only intervention by Enki's creatures, fashioned specifically to enter the Kur, allows her resurrection and escape. The poem is typically read as death and rebirth mythology, seasonal allegory, or shamanic initiation. But examined closely, it describes infiltration of hostile territory controlled by rival faction. Ereshkigal rules the Kur independently of surface Anunnaki authority. She maintains her own power structure, her own laws, her own defences. When Inanna enters this territory without permission, she's captured, tried, and executed. The Kur functions as independent state, outside the jurisdiction of Enlil's authority, or Anu's decree. Ninurta's battles against the Asaku occur in the Kur, described as mountain region where hostile forces gather. The text emphasizes the Kur as boundary zone, edge of civilized territory where order breaks down and chaos threatens. Defeating the Asaku in the Kur establishes control over this dangerous frontier, extending Anunnaki authority into regions previously beyond their reach. After victory, Ninurta reorganizes the Kur, categorizing its stones and minerals, establishing which materials are safe for human use and which remain dangerous. Its colonization of previously uncontrolled territory following military campaign. Gilgamesh's journey beyond the Kur to find Utnapishti describes the Kur as barrier, geographic feature that must be crossed to reach the place where immortals dwell. He passes through the Mashu Mountains, guarded by scorpion beings, travels through darkness for 12 double hours, emerges into garden of jeweled trees, and crosses waters of death to reach Utnapishti. The Kur in this context functions as boundary between mortal and divine realms, between accessible world and territory reserved for gods and their chosen survivors. Some tablets describe defeated gods being imprisoned in the Kur. After the Anzu bird steals the Tablet of Destinies and is defeated by Ninurta, fragments suggest the Anzu is imprisoned in the Kur rather than killed. After Tiamat's army is defeated, some of her allied gods are assigned to service while others are sent to the Kur, as if it functions as prison for beings too dangerous to kill, but too powerful to allow freedom. The geographic descriptions, when examined collectively, point toward the Zagros Mountains, the range that forms boundary between Mesopotamian lowlands and the Iranian plateau. The Zagros rises abruptly from the plain, reaching heights over 4,000 meters, containing caves, valleys, passes, regions that remain difficult to access even with modern transportation. In Sumerian times, the Zagros would have represented true frontier, beyond easy control, inhabited by peoples who didn't answer to Mesopotamian authority, terrain where fugitives could hide, where defeated factions could retreat and potentially regroup. If the Anunnaki conflicts were actual wars fought by beings or factions with physical presence, the Zagros would be logical refuge for defeated forces. The mountains offer defensible positions, resources, water, caves for shelter or concealment. A faction losing control of Mesopotamian cities could withdraw into the Zagros and maintain resistance indefinitely, neither fully defeated nor able to return. The Kur would then be remembered as a place where defeated gods went, where some remained imprisoned by terrain and isolation, where others perhaps still dwelt, diminished but present. The consistency with which texts reference the Kur as place where divine beings go in defeat or exile suggests geographic reality beneath mythological overlay. Whether it's the Zagros specifically, or some other boundary region, the Kur represents territory outside normal control, where standard rules don't apply, where beings from the former times might persist, where the outcomes of ancient wars remain unresolved. It's liminal space, neither fully earthly nor fully divine, prison and refuge simultaneously, edge of the known world where memory preserves what mainstream narrative cannot comfortably contain. And just as the Kur exists between categories, so too does the astronomical knowledge the Sumerians possessed. Falling uncomfortably between what Bronze Age culture should know and what their texts demonstrate they did know, Sumerian astronomical texts demonstrate mathematical precision that scholars still struggle to explain. The mul.apin tablets describe planetary movements, predict eclipses, and track stellar positions with accuracy that shouldn't exist without telescopes. Their calculations of Earth's precession, a 26,000-year cycle, suggest observation periods spanning millennia, or knowledge inherited from earlier sources. When scholars ask how Bronze Age people achieve this precision, one answer appears in the texts themselves. The Anunnaki taught it. Whether this represents preserved knowledge from an earlier advanced culture, or whether the Anunnaki mythology developed to explain mysterious inherited knowledge, remains one of archaeology's most persistent questions. The Mulapin tablets, compiled around 1000 BCE but containing material dated much earlier, represent comprehensive astronomical compendium. They list stars visible throughout the year, organized by constellations. They describe planetary movements with mathematical precision. They provide methods for tracking Venus, Jupiter, Mercury, Saturn, Mars through the night sky. They include eclipse prediction tables. They calculate the length of day and night across seasons. They describe the heliacal rising of specific stars, the moment stars become visible on the eastern horizon before sunrise, used for calendrical calculations. The precision is remarkable. The tablets track planetary positions to within degrees of arc. They predict lunar eclipses years in advance. They understand that planets move at different speeds, that their apparent motion against the fixed stars follows patterns that repeat cyclically, but with variations requiring sophisticated calculation to predict accurately. This isn't casual stargazing, this is mathematical astronomy, systematic observation combined with predictive modelling. Most troubling is the precession calculation. Earth wobbles on its axis in a cycle lasting approximately 26,000 years, causing the position of stars to shift very slowly over centuries. The effect is barely perceptible within single human lifetime. Detecting it requires comparing stellar positions across generations, maintaining records over centuries, recognizing pattern that unfolds slower than recorded history. Yet Sumerian texts demonstrate awareness of precession, describe it in their astronomical models, incorporate it into their long-term calendrical calculations. How did they know? The standard archaeological answer suggests accumulated observation across Sumerian civilization's 3,000-year span, records maintained through rise and fall of dynasties, knowledge preserved in temple schools and passed from generation to generation. Possible, but it requires assuming observational astronomy began in the Ubaid period, around 5000 BCE, and maintained meticulous records continuously through all subsequent upheavals, wars, city destructions, dynasty changes. Possible, but requiring conditions that seem unlikely. The alternative explanation appears in the texts themselves. The Anunnaki taught astronomy to humans. Enki, and sometimes Anu himself, transmitted astronomical knowledge to chosen priests or sages. The 7 sages, the Apkallu, who established civilization before the flood, taught astronomy among many other skills. The texts don't describe humans discovering astronomy through patient observation, but receiving it as gift, complete system transmitted from beings who already possessed it. If the Anunnaki existed as technologically advanced beings, they would possess sophisticated astronomy naturally. Navigation between planets requires precise understanding of orbital mechanics, gravitational fields, relative positions over time. A civilization capable of travelling between worlds would necessarily have astronomy far beyond what humans developed independently. Teaching that astronomy to humans would transmit knowledge requiring thousands of years of observation in single transfer, giving Sumerian civilization mathematical astronomy fully formed rather than gradually developed. But there's third possibility. The Anunnaki mythology might have developed to explain knowledge that existed without clear origin. If Sumerian culture inherited astronomical texts, mathematical tables, predictive models from some earlier civilization whose identity was lost, they would need to explain where this knowledge came from. Attributing it to gods, to the Anunnaki who established civilization, would make sense. The mythology would then be explanatory framework for genuine but mysterious inherited knowledge. This interpretation aligns with global patterns. Many ancient cultures possessed astronomical knowledge, exceeding what their technological level suggests they should achieve independently. The Maya predicted Venus cycles with precision matching modern calculation. Polynesian navigators crossed the Pacific using star knowledge transmitted orally across generations. The builders of Stonehenge aligned massive stones to solar and lunar cycles with mathematical accuracy. Either every culture independently developed sophisticated astronomy, or knowledge was shared, inherited, preserved from sources we no longer recognize. The Sumerian texts don't hide the transmission. They explicitly state the Anunnaki taught astronomy, along with mathematics, writing, agriculture, metallurgy, everything that constitutes civilization. Modern scholarship tends to read this as mythological personification of gradual cultural development. But the Sumerians themselves insisted knowledge came from outside, was gifted, was taught by beings who possessed it already and chose to share it. And in the 20th century, one researcher took this claim literally, building comprehensive theory that challenged everything mainstream archaeology assumed about ancient Mesopotamia. No discussion of Anunnaki warfare can avoid Zecharia Sitchin, the 20th century researcher whose translations of Sumerian texts propose that the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth for gold mining and genetically engineered humanity as a labour force. His 12 books built on Sumerian texts, particularly the Atrahasis and Enuma Elish, to argue that ancient myths were actually historical accounts of advanced alien civilization. Mainstream scholars reject his translations as fundamentally flawed, his interpretations as unsupported by linguistic evidence. Yet his work resonates because he asks the question many avoid. What if the Sumerians meant exactly what they wrote? The conflict between academic rejection and popular acceptance of Sitchin's theories reveals deep disagreement about how to read ancient texts. Sitchin's first book, quote 35, published in 1976, proposed that the Anunnaki came from a planet called Nibiru, following highly elliptical orbit that brings it into inner solar system every 3,600 years. According to Sitchin's reading of Enuma Elish, Nibiru collided with primordial planet Tiamat, splitting it to create Earth and the asteroid belt. The Anunnaki from Nibiru established operations on Earth to mine gold, needed to repair their planet's atmosphere. They created humans by genetically modifying existing hominids, producing workers capable of understanding instructions, but dependent on Anunnaki authority. Sitchin built this narrative from Sumerian texts, reading them literally. When texts say the Anunnaki came from heaven to earth, he interpreted this as space travel. When texts describe Anunnaki creating humans from clay mixed with divine blood, he interpreted this as genetic engineering. When texts describe conflicts between Anunnaki factions, he interpreted these as literal wars between extraterrestrial visitors using advanced technology. Everything in Sumerian mythology, according to Sitchin, Was historical record misunderstood by scholars who refused to take ancient testimony at face value? The academic response was immediate and harsh. Sitchin had no formal training in Assyriology. His Sumerian translations were often incorrect, mistranslating words, ignoring grammatical context, reading signs with wrong phonetic values. His astronomical claims about Nibiru's orbit contradicted basic physics. No planet could maintain stable elliptical orbit entering the inner solar system every 3,600 years without disrupting other planetary orbits catastrophically. His genetic engineering claims predated modern understanding of DNA but made assumptions about biological manipulation that seemed scientifically implausible. Yet Sitchin's work found massive popular audience. His books sold millions of copies. They inspired documentary series, websites, entire subcultures devoted to ancient astronaut theory. The reason is simple. He took ancient texts seriously. He asked why Sumerians would describe the Anunnaki descending from heaven if they didn't mean literal descent. Why describe human creation through mixing of divine blood if they didn't mean literal genetic manipulation? Why describe wars with devastating weapons if they didn't mean actual technological warfare? Mainstream archaeology had answers to these questions. Mythology uses symbolic language. The Anunnaki descending from heaven represents theological concept of divine origin, not physical travel. Human creation from clay represents emergence of consciousness, distinction between humans and animals, not biological engineering. Divine warfare represents natural disasters, political conflicts, psychological drama, not actual combat. Everything Sitchin read literally, scholarship read metaphorically. But here's where the debate becomes uncomfortable. The Sumerians themselves don't signal metaphorical intent. They archive war narratives alongside administrative records. They describe divine conflicts with same specificity used for human history. They treat astronomical knowledge as transmitted rather than discovered. They built massive infrastructure projects, ziggurats, irrigation systems, cities, based on instructions they claimed came from gods who descended from heaven. Either they were entirely deluded, participating in culture-wide elaborate fantasy, or they were recording something that made sense to them, something that doesn't fit comfortable categories of myth versus history. Sitchin's specific translations may be wrong, his planetary physics might be impossible, his genetic theories might oversimplify, but his fundamental question remains valid. What if ancient people meant what they said? What if we've been too quick to dismiss testimony as metaphor simply because it contradicts our assumptions about what Bronze Age cultures should have known or experienced? The conflict between Sitchin's theories and academic consensus reveals how we approach ancient texts. Do we trust ancient testimony or modern interpretation? Do we read texts through their author's apparent intent or through frameworks we impose? Do we take seriously the possibility that human history might be stranger than conventional archaeology allows? These questions don't have easy answers, and they remain alive specifically because Sitchin asked them loudly enough that ignoring them became impossible. And nowhere does Sitchin's influence appear more controversially than in the nuclear war theory, the proposal that some Anunnaki conflicts involved weapons whose descriptions match atomic devastation. Some researchers, examining Sumerian descriptions of divine warfare, have proposed that certain conflicts involve nuclear weapons. The Erra epic's descriptions of heat without fire, persistent contamination, slow death, and poisoned ground match radiation effects. The Mohenjo-Daro archaeological site in the Indus Valley shows evidence of extreme heat that vitrified stone, though conventional explanations suggest fire rather than nuclear reaction. The biblical destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, likely drawing from Mesopotamian sources, describes fire from heaven, pillars of salt, devastation so complete that the land remains barren millennia later. These parallels are intriguing but scientifically unproven, existing in the uncomfortable space between mythology, archaeology, and speculative interpretation. The Erra epic descriptions are disturbingly specific. Heat that kills without conventional fire, contamination that makes land uninhabitable for generations. Victims who initially survive but deteriorate progressively, exhibiting symptoms matching acute radiation syndrome, nausea, hair loss, skin lesions, immune system collapse, internal bleeding. The weapons produce blinding flash. The destruction extends beyond immediate blast zone, carried by wind, contaminating water, making food sources dangerous. Survivors flee the affected regions because remaining there causes death. Modern readers familiar with nuclear weapons recognize these descriptions immediately. Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors reported identical symptoms. The initial flash, the heat pulse, the radiation sickness developing over days and weeks, the contamination making buildings and earth dangerous to touch. Either Bronze Age poets possessed remarkably prophetic imagination, or they were describing something they'd witnessed or inherited memory of, events that matched nuclear devastation in every particular except name. The Mohenjo-daro connection adds archaeological intrigue. This Indus Valley city, contemporary with Sumerian civilization, shows evidence of sudden abandonment around 1900 BCE. Some structures show signs of intense heat exposure. Scattered skeletal remains suggest people died suddenly in the streets. Early excavators, including David Davenport and Ettore Vincenti, claim to find evidence of vitrification, sand and stone fused by temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius, too hot for conventional fire, suggesting nuclear-level heat. Modern archaeology disputes these claims. Later analysis suggests the vitrification evidence was misinterpreted, that what early excavators saw as fusion from extreme heat was natural formation or result of conventional fire enhanced by specific materials. The scattered skeletal remains likely result from normal mortality across centuries, not simultaneous catastrophe. The city's abandonment matches patterns seen throughout the Indus Valley civilization's decline, are potentially caused by climate change, river shifts, economic collapse, not warfare. But the controversy persists because conventional explanations feel inadequate to some researchers. Mohenjo-daro's end remains mysterious. The Indus script remains undeciphered, preventing understanding of what the inhabitants themselves recorded. The timing roughly correlates with upheavals across the ancient Near East, the end of the early Bronze Age, when multiple civilizations collapsed simultaneously. Whether this represents natural disaster, climate catastrophe, widespread warfare, or something stranger remains genuinely uncertain. The biblical Sodom and Gomorrah account parallels Mesopotamian destruction narratives: fire from heaven, complete devastation, land rendered barren. Lot's wife transformed to salt pillar, detail suggesting her exposure to something that crystallized or contaminated her. The Dead Sea region where these cities supposedly existed shows unusual geological features, salt formations, barren areas where nothing grows. Either these natural features inspired the biblical narrative, or the narrative preserves memory of actual catastrophe that created or enhanced these features. Sitchin and his followers argued these parallels prove ancient nuclear war, that Anunnaki factions used atomic weapons against each other, devastating regions across the Near East, Indus Valley, perhaps other locations where evidence has been misinterpreted or remains undiscovered. They point to Hindu texts, the Mahabharata, which describes weapons called Brahmastra with similar effects. Blinding light, devastating heat, contamination, descriptions that some read as nuclear warfare in ancient India. Mainstream scholarship rejects this entirely. There's no physical evidence of ancient nuclear weapons, no radiation signatures, no crater patterns, no isotope distributions matching what atomic detonations would produce. The geological and archaeological evidence has natural explanations. The textual descriptions, while striking, can be understood as poetic exaggeration, as metaphorical description of natural disasters, a psychological projection of human fear of destruction given divine scale. Yet the debate continues because the descriptions remain troubling. The specificity of symptoms, the persistence of contamination, the heat without fire, the poisoned ground. Either ancient poets independently invented descriptions matching nuclear effects centuries before such weapons existed, or they were preserving memory of something that produced similar results through different means, or they witnessed or inherited memory of technology that actually was nuclear. None of these options is comfortable, which is why the controversy remains unresolved, generating more heat than light, dividing researchers into camps that struggle to hear each other across methodological chasms. And underlying all these debates, all these controversial interpretations, lies the fundamental chronological problem that makes verification nearly impossible. Sumerian texts reference the former times with frustrating vagueness. King lists describe reigns of tens of thousands of years before a flood, after which reigns become humanly plausible. Chronologically, this places described conflicts anywhere from 5,000 to 50,000 years before the texts were written, pushing events into prehistory where archaeological evidence becomes nearly impossible to verify. Some scholars dismiss pre-flood chronology as entirely mythological. Others suggest the texts preserve cultural memory of actual Neolithic or even Paleolithic events, compressed and mythologized but rooted in real catastrophes. The war narratives could describe Bronze Age political conflicts projected onto divine characters, or they could be humanity's oldest historical records, depending on how literally we read the chronology. The Sumerian king list presents this problem starkly. It begins with kingship descending from heaven to Eridu. The first king, Alulim, rules for 28,800 years. The second, Alalangar, rules for 36,000 years. 5 cities, 8 kings. Reigns totaling 241,200 years, all before the flood. Then the flood sweeps over. Kingship descends from heaven again, this time to Kish, and suddenly the reigns become shorter but still implausible. Gore rules for 1,200 years. Gula-Nidaba Anapad rules for 960 years. Gradually across the list reigns shorten toward historically plausible lengths, reaching human lifespans by the early dynastic period. Around 2600 BCE, scholars interpret this in multiple ways. The traditional view treats pre-flood chronology as entirely mythological, invented to give Sumerian civilization immense antiquity, competing with Egyptian claims to ancient origins. The huge numbers don't represent actual time but mythological eons, symbolic of an age when divine beings ruled before humans took over. The flood marks transition from mythological prehistory to quasi-historical period, where real kings ruled real cities but their reigns were still exaggerated. But other researchers note the list's internal consistency. The numbers aren't random. They follow mathematical patterns based on Sumerian sexagesmal system. They appear in multiple independent copies with minimal variation. The list was maintained across centuries, copied and updated as new dynasties rose. Either this represents extraordinarily consistent mythological invention, or the numbers mean something the Sumerians understood differently than we do. One proposal suggests different time measurements. If the years used for pre-flood kings actually represented months, lunar cycles, or some other shorter period, the chronology becomes more plausible. 28,800 months equals roughly 2,400 years. Still long, but within range of extreme longevity or multiple rulers with same name conflated. But this interpretation requires assuming the Sumerians used inconsistent time measurements within single document without signalling the change, which seems unlikely for culture known for mathematical precision. Another proposal suggests the numbers represent reigns of dynasties rather than individuals, that a Lulim represents a Lulim line, multiple rulers whose combined reigns total 28,800 years. This pushes Sumerian civilization back into deep prehistory, potentially to the end of the last ice age or beyond, suggesting cultural continuity spanning 10 or 20,000 years. Possible, but requiring evidence that mainstream archaeology hasn't found cities or settlements of appropriate age showing cultural continuity with later Sumerian civilization. The flood itself presents dating challenges. Geological evidence shows multiple flooding events in Mesopotamian prehistory. The Persian Gulf was dry land during Ice Age sea level lows, becoming submerged as glaciers melted between 15,000 and 8,000 years ago. This would have devastated coastal settlements, forced population migrations, created cultural memory of catastrophic inundation. River flooding from Tigris and Euphrates left archaeological evidence at multiple Mesopotamian sites. Destruction layers dated to various periods in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. Which flood do the texts reference? The answer matters because it determines whether Anunnaki conflicts occurred in the Upper Paleolithic, the Neolithic, the Chalcolithic, or the Early Bronze Age. Each period has different implications for what technology might have existed, what evidence might be found, how literally we should read the text's descriptions of divine warfare. If the wars occurred in deep prehistory, before 12,000 years ago, almost no direct evidence would survive. Sea level rise would have submerged coastal areas where advanced cultures might have existed. Glaciation cycles would have scoured landscapes. Organic materials would have decayed. Only stone would persist, and stone artifacts are notoriously difficult to date precisely or attribute to specific cultures. The Anunnaki could have fought their wars 20,000 years ago and left almost no archaeological signature we'd recognise today. If the wars occurred in the Neolithic, 8 to 6,000 years ago, more evidence should exist, but interpretation becomes difficult. Neolithic sites show increasing sophistication: agriculture, pottery, permanent settlements, early metallurgy. But nothing suggesting advanced technology. Nothing matching the weapons described in war texts. Either the texts greatly exaggerate technological capabilities, or the most advanced technology was removed, destroyed, or degraded beyond recognition after the conflicts ended. If the wars occurred in the Bronze Age, contemporary with the texts that describe them, we should find clear evidence: destruction layers, unusual weapons, technological anomalies. Some researchers claim such evidence exists but is misinterpreted. Others note absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that we've excavated tiny fraction of potential sites. Still, others argue the complete lack of physical evidence proves the narratives are mythology, not history. The timeline problem has no resolution with current evidence. The Sumerian texts themselves insist the events they describe occurred in the former times, before recorded history, in an age when different rules applied and different beings walked the earth. Whether this represents mythological framework for understanding human origins, or actual historical memory compressed and preserved through millennia, or something between these extremes, remains one of archaeology's most persistent mysteries, and perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some questions are meant to remain open, hovering between knowledge and speculation, reminding us that the past holds depths we haven't fully explored and may never completely understand. The Descent of Inanna, one of Sumerian literature's most famous poems, describes the goddess travelling to the underworld, passing through 7 gates, dying, and being resurrected. Surface reading treats this as death and rebirth mythology, seasonal allegory, or initiation rite. But examined closely, the text describes a journey through defended territory, controlled by hostile forces, where Inanna must surrender her divine powers, her me, at each gate. Her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, judges and kills her. Enki must intervene to retrieve her body. The entire narrative parallels military infiltration, capture and rescue more than religious metaphor. Some scholars suggest Inanna's descent preserves memory of conflicts between Anunnaki factions controlling different territories, mythologized over centuries. The poem opens with Inanna abandoning heaven and earth to descend to the underworld, described as the Kur, to attend funeral rites for Ereshkigal's husband, Gugalana, the Bull of Heaven. but the text immediately signals this journey isn't a simple visit. Inanna prepares carefully, gathering all 7 of her her divine powers, wearing them as protection. She instructs her servant Ninshubur with specific contingency plans. If Inanna doesn't return in 3 days, go to Enlil for help, then to Nanna, then to Enki. The preparation suggests Inanna knows she's entering hostile territory where her divine status might not protect her. The descent itself unfolds with military precision. 7 gates. At each gate, a gatekeeper demands Inanna surrender one of her First her crown, then her lapis lazuli necklace, her breastplate, her gold ring, her measuring rod and line, her royal robe. Finally, her underworld garment itself. By the 7th gate she enters naked and powerless, stripped of everything that made her divine, vulnerable before her sister's throne. The systematic stripping reads less like ritual and more like capture protocol. Enemy entering hostile territory must surrender weapons, armor, insignia of rank, everything that grants power or protection. By the time Inanna reaches Ereshkigal, she has no defense, no authority, no means of resistance. The Anunnaki judges of the underworld condemn her. Ereshkigal kills her. Her corpse is hung on a hook. The text is explicit. Inanna dies. This isn't metaphorical death. The goddess, stripped of her divine powers, is executed and displayed as warning. 3 days and 3 nights pass. Ninshubur follows Inanna's instructions. Enlil refuses help, stating Inanna brought this on herself by entering the underworld uninvited. Nanna also refuses. Only Enki responds. He creates 2 beings from dirt beneath his fingernails, creatures small enough to slip past the underworld's defences, beings without gender who can enter Ereshkigal's realm unnoticed. He instructs them to sympathise with Ereshkigal, who is suffering, to echo her lamentations, and in gratitude she will offer them anything they ask. They should request Inanna's corpse. The plan works. The creatures enter the underworld, find Ereshkigal in pain, mirror her suffering, earn her gratitude. When she offers reward, they ask for the corpse hanging on the hook. Ereshkigal grants it. They sprinkle the food and water of life on Inanna's body. She revives. But escaping the underworld isn't simple. The underworld's laws state that no one who enters can leave without providing substitute. Demons called Gala attach themselves to Inanna, following her to the surface to claim replacement. Inanna searches for acceptable substitute. She finds her husband Dumuzi sitting on a throne, dressed in fine clothes, apparently unconcerned by her 3-day absence. Enraged, she designates him as substitute. The Gala sees Dumuzi. He flees but is eventually captured. The final resolution involves Dumuzi and his sister Inanna, alternating 6-month periods in the underworld, creating the cycle that many scholars interpret as seasonal myth, explaining agricultural patterns. But readers' political narrative, the descent describes attempted takeover of Ereshkigal's territory that fails because Inanna underestimates her sister's power. Ereshkigal controls the underworld independently, maintains her own forces, enforces her own laws that even other Anunnaki must respect. When Inanna enters without permission, possibly attempting to extend her influence or claim territory during transition period after Gugalanna's death, Ereshkigal responds with execution, asserting absolute authority within her realm. The rescue operation requires circumventing normal channels, because Enlil and Nanna refuse to challenge Ereshkigal's sovereignty. Only Enki, who consistently subverts established authority, intervenes with unconventional method that avoids direct confrontation. The substitute requirement might represent negotiated settlement, ransom paid for Inanna's release, with Dumuzi serving as hostage, ensuring Inanna won't attempt further incursions. The geographic specificity supports this reading. Inanna travels from Uruk to the underworld, passing through specific waypoints where the Gala later catch up. Ereshkigal's realm has defined borders, controlled access, defensive structure, The 7 gates aren't metaphorical but actual checkpoints, each forcing surrender of specific items, systematic disarmament of potential threat. The underworld functions as independent state ruled by Queen who maintains armed forces, the Gala, capable of pursuing targets beyond her territory's borders. Whether this preserves memory of actual territorial conflicts between Anunnaki factions, or represents mythological working through of political tensions in Sumerian culture, the text clearly describes power struggle, capture, execution, and rescue operation conducted between entities controlling different spheres of influence. It's one of many Sumerian narratives suggesting the Anunnaki were not unified pantheon, but collection of factions with competing interests, territories, and willingness to use violence against each other. And threading through all these conflict narratives is the chronological framework that places events in the former times, the age when beings who were not quite human ruled from cities and lived for spans that defy biological plausibility. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2000 BCE but claiming to record rulers from when kingship descended from heaven, presents chronological problems that scholars still debate. Early kings rule for tens of thousands of years. Alulim, first king of Eridu, supposedly ruled for 28,800 years. Then a flood occurs, sweeping over the earth. After the flood, reigns become shorter but still implausible, hundreds or thousands of years. Then gradually they shorten to human lifespans. Either this represents entirely mythological prehistory, or the Sumerians were using different time measurements, or the list preserves memory of beings who lived far longer than humans, the Anunnaki themselves perhaps, whose conflicts and dynasties predated human civilization. The king list exists in multiple copies discovered at various sites, all preserving remarkably consistent chronology, despite being copied centuries apart by different scribes. The text opens with declaration. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. This isn't metaphorical language. The text states kingship descended, came from above, was given to earth by higher authority. Eridu receives it first, the oldest city, place where Enki's temple stood, where the Abzu was accessed. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years sets pattern. His successor, Alalngar, rules 36,000 years. Next comes Enmenluana of Bad Tibira, ruling 43,200 years. The numbers aren't random. They follow mathematical relationships based on Sumerian base 60 counting system. The precision suggests the scribes believed these numbers had meaning, represented something real that required exact preservation. 5 cities receive kingship before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shuruppak. 8 kings total. Their combined reigns equal 241,200 years. Then the text states simply, the flood swept over. Everything changes. Kingship descends from heaven again, this time to Kish, and suddenly reigns become shorter, though still superhuman. Gore of Kish rules 1,200 years. His successors rule 900, 600, 400 years. The decline continues through subsequent dynasties until reaching plausible human lifespans around 2600 BCE. The pattern is clear: longest reigns before flood, progressively shorter reigns after flood, eventual normalization to human mortality. Either this represents mythological ages gradually becoming historical, or it documents actual biological change. Beings who lived millennia being replaced by beings with normal lifespans, the Anunnaki giving way to humans as rulers. Some researchers propose the pre-flood numbers represent dynasties, not individuals, that each name designates ruling house rather than single king. This would make the numbers more plausible, but still pushes Sumerian civilization back into deep prehistory. If Alulim's dynasty ruled 28,800 years, even with average reign of 50 years per individual king, we're talking about 576 successive rulers, suggesting civilization extending back to the end of the last ice age or beyond. Others suggest different time measurements. Perhaps the years were lunar months, seasons, some other shorter period that the scribes didn't bother explaining because their audience understood. But this creates problems with the text's internal consistency. Later sections of the king list give reigns in years that we can verify historically. If the time measurement changed between pre-flood and post-flood sections, you'd expect the text to signal this somehow. It doesn't. The flood itself functions as chronological divider, separating mythological age from quasi-historical period. Every ancient Near Eastern culture preserves flood traditions, suggesting actual catastrophic flooding event in deep prehistory that became culturally foundational. Geological evidence supports major flooding in Mesopotamia at various periods. The Persian Gulf basin was dry land during glaciation, becoming submerged as sea levels rose between 15 and 8,000 years ago. River flooding from Tigris and Euphrates left destruction layers at multiple sites throughout the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. The king list doesn't specify when the flood occurred, only that it separated two distinct periods. Before flood, extremely long rains, possibly representing Anunnaki rule directly. After flood, progressively shorter reigns, transition from divine to human kingship. The narrative matches other texts describing the flood as a weapon deployed by the Anunnaki Council, devastation so complete it resets civilization, after which humanity rebuilt with less direct divine intervention. What makes the king list remarkable is its persistence. Sumerian scribes maintained this document across centuries, updating it as new dynasties rose, preserving the pre-flood chronology unchanged. They clearly considered this information important, essential to understanding Sumerian civilization's origins. Whether the numbers represent literal time spans, symbolic ages, coded information we no longer understand, or actual historical memory of beings who lived far longer than modern humans, the list preserves the Sumerian claim that their civilization was ancient beyond normal reckoning, that it began with kingship lowered from heaven by beings whose lifespans and capabilities exceeded human limitation. And perhaps somewhere among the hundreds of thousands of untranslated tablets gathering dust in museum basements worldwide, more detailed accounts wait to be read, chronicles that would clarify what the king list preserves in abbreviated form. Most cuneiform tablets in museum collections worldwide remain untranslated. Not because scholars lack ability, but because there aren't enough specialists and funding. The British Museum alone holds over 130,000 cuneiform tablets, the majority never fully translated. The University of Pennsylvania, Yale, the Louvre, museums across Europe and America all hold vast collections of Mesopotamian texts that haven't been read in 4,000 years. Among these untranslated fragments could be detailed accounts of Anunnaki conflicts, technological descriptions, historical records that would answer questions we've debated for centuries. Or they might be tax records and grain receipts. We won't know until someone presses funding into Assyriology programs and trains a new generation to read what ancient hands pressed into clay. The scale of untranslated material is staggering. When archaeologists excavated Mesopotamian sites in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they shipped tablets by the thousands to European and American museums. The tablets were catalogued by basic physical characteristics: size, condition, apparent age, fine spot. But reading them required specialists trained in multiple ancient languages, comfortable with various cuneiform scripts, capable of recognizing different text types and historical periods. There were never enough such specialists, there still aren't. The British Museum's collection represents accumulated material from 150 years of excavation and acquisition. 130,000 tablets. Recent estimates suggest fewer than 20% have been fully translated and published. The rest sit in storage, carefully preserved in climate-controlled environments, available to researchers but largely unread because there aren't enough researchers to read them. The University of Pennsylvania Museum holds tablets from the Nippur expeditions, the largest single excavation of any Mesopotamian city. 30,000 fragments. Many were translated in the early 20th century by pioneers like Leon Lagrange and Samuel Noah Kramer, but thousands remain unread. Particularly the more fragmentary pieces, the broken tablets where only portions of text survive, requiring painstaking work to contextualize and interpret. Yale's Babylonian collection, the Louvre's Near Eastern department, collections in Berlin, Istanbul, Baghdad, smaller holdings in dozens of other institutions worldwide, all contain thousands of cuneiform tablets awaiting translation. Some are beautifully preserved, complete texts that could be published immediately if someone had time to read them. Others are fragments, challenging puzzles requiring expertise, patience, comparative work with other texts. All represent voices from ancient world, preserved in clay, waiting to speak again. The tragedy is that we don't know what we're missing. Among those untranslated tablets could be detailed chronicles of Anunnaki conflicts, describing battles with specificity that would clarify whether these were mythological constructs or preserved historical accounts. There could be technological texts, instructions for creating or operating the me, descriptions of weapons used in divine warfare, engineering documents for ziggurat construction that would reveal their actual purpose. There could be astronomical observations extending the precision we've already found, mathematical texts advancing our understanding of Sumerian capabilities, medical knowledge we've lost and could recover, or they could be economic records, temple inventories, tax assessments, land transfers, marriage contracts, legal disputes, the mundane documentation of civilization that archaeologists must sift through to find rare dramatic narratives. The statistical reality is that most tablets are administrative. Mesopotamian bureaucracy was thorough, recording everything, creating redundant copies, maintaining archives across centuries. For every epic poem, there are hundreds of receipts for barley deliveries, but we can't know which is which without reading them. A fragment catalogued as economic text might contain marginal notation referencing a historical event. A seemingly mundane temple inventory might list me with descriptions clarifying their nature. A legal document might reference war damage, naming weapons, describing destruction, preserving details that would connect mythological narratives to historical reality. The field of Assyriology suffers from chronic underfunding. Universities close programs. Positions aren't refilled when professors retire. Graduate students choose more practical specializations. The number of people capable of reading Akkadian and Sumerian cuneiform decreases while the volume of untranslated material remains constant. Digital initiatives help, photographing tablets, creating databases, using computer analysis to identify text types, and partially reconstruct broken pieces. But the actual reading, the interpretation, the translation into modern languages that would make these texts accessible to wider audiences, this still requires human expertise, and there aren't enough humans with that expertise. The lost knowledge isn't actually lost, it's preserved, sitting in museum storage, waiting. The Sumerians succeeded in their goal of recording information in durable medium that would survive millennia. The tablets endured, the cuneiform marks remain legible. But if no one reads them, if funding never materializes, if the remaining specialists retire without training successors, then in practical terms the knowledge is lost even though the tablets survive. Somewhere in those collections might be the account that would settle debates about Anunnaki warfare, that would provide the missing chronological details, that would describe the technology behind the ME, or explain the astronomical precision or detail the conflicts in ways that would force reconsideration of everything we think we know about ancient Mesopotamia, or there might not be. But we won't know until someone does the work, and the work isn't being done at scale that would make significant progress in our lifetimes. The tablets wait. The ancient voices preserved in clay remain silent, not because they have nothing to say, but because no one is listening. Yet even with limited resources, even with vast amounts of textual evidence still unread, archaeology has uncovered physical evidence of conflicts that match the violence described in divine war narratives. Beyond texts, what does physical archaeology reveal about ancient conflicts in Sumer? Excavations at Uruk show sudden destruction layers from the late 4th millennium BCE. Tel Brak in Syria shows evidence of mass violence and burning. Hamukar, one of the world's oldest cities, was destroyed in what appears to be organised military assault around 3500 BCE. Walls show evidence of sling bullets, fire, and systematic destruction. Whether these archaeological destruction layers connect to mythological war narratives remains uncertain. What's clear is that Mesopotamian civilization developed against a background of real, devastating conflicts that left physical evidence matching the violence described in divine war myths. Uruk, Sumerian civilization's greatest city, shows multiple destruction layers throughout its occupation. The late 4th millennium BCE layer is particularly dramatic. Buildings burned, walls collapsed. Evidence suggests rapid abandonment. When archaeologists first uncovered this destruction, they initially attributed it to accident, natural disaster, perhaps earthquake and subsequent fire, but closer examination revealed patterns suggesting deliberate destruction. Walls were systematically demolished, storage areas were ransacked. The destruction was selective, targeting administrative and religious structures while some residential areas survived relatively intact. Tel Brak in Syria, contemporary with early Sumerian civilization, shows similar evidence. The site flourished in the 4th millennium BCE, developing complex urban organization, monumental architecture, specialized craft production. Then, around 3300 BCE, destruction. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous: mass violence. Buildings burned simultaneously, streets filled with debris from systematic demolition. Skeletal remains show signs of violent trauma. The city was rebuilt afterward, but smaller, simpler, as if the attack had broken its power permanently. Hamukar presents perhaps the clearest evidence of ancient warfare. Excavations revealed massive defensive wall, over 3 meters thick, built to protect the city from external threat. The wall didn't save them. Around 3500 BCE, Hamukar was attacked. The archaeological evidence preserves the assault in remarkable detail. Over 1,200 clay sling bullets scattered around the walls and throughout the city. Bullets weren't casual weapons. They required specialized production, trained slingers, organized military structure. Finding 1,200 suggests the actual number used was far higher, that this was sustained attack by force with significant resources. The walls show impact damage. Buildings burned. The destruction layer contains collapsed architecture, burned goods, abandoned possessions. When archaeologists excavated residential areas, they found rooms with valuables still inside, as if inhabitants fled suddenly or were killed before they could gather belongings. The pattern matches what texts describe: organized military assault using specialized weapons, systematic destruction of cities' defenses and infrastructure, complete defeat of defending population. What makes these archaeological findings significant is their timing. The destruction layers date to periods when Sumerian civilization was supposedly flowering, when cities were growing, when the Anunnaki, according to texts, were still actively present or recently departed. If divine warfare was occurring, it would leave marks exactly like what archaeology finds: cities destroyed, populations devastated, evidence of weapons and violence on scale, requiring organized military capability. The challenge is connecting physical evidence to textual narratives. The tablets describe divine wars. Archaeology shows human conflicts. Were the divine wars actually human conflicts mythologized? Were they separate events, with gods fighting in heaven while humans warred on earth? Or were the Anunnaki factions using human armies as proxies, fighting through mortal allies, turning human conflicts into extensions of divine rivalries? some destruction layers remain unexplained by conventional warfare. Jericho shows walls collapsed outward, not inward as would occur from external attack, suggesting internal explosion or earthquake. Certain sites show evidence of extreme heat, vitrification of materials, temperatures exceeding what conventional Bronze Age weapons could produce. These anomalies could represent unusual natural disasters, experimental weapons, or evidence that conventional understanding of Bronze Age technology is incomplete. What's undeniable is that Mesopotamian civilization arose in a context of violent conflict. The earliest cities built defensive walls, the earliest texts describe wars, the archaeological record shows repeated destruction and rebuilding. Whatever the Anunnaki conflicts represented, whether divine warfare, human political violence, or something between, they occurred against background where actual devastating conflicts were constant reality. The Sumerians lived with war. They experienced cities destroyed, populations killed, civilization threatened. When they described gods fighting with devastating weapons, they were describing violence they understood intimately from direct experience. The physical evidence and textual evidence together create a picture of ancient world far more violent, more unstable, more dramatic than conventional narratives suggest. And this returns us to the fundamental question that drives continued interest in Anunnaki narratives, despite academic skepticism and unresolved controversies. 5,000 years after Sumerians pressed warnings and histories into wet clay, we're still excavating their ruins, translating their tablets, asking what they meant and whether they knew something we've forgotten. The Anunnaki conflict narratives persist because they suggest civilization's foundation might be stranger than we admit. Because precision in ancient texts troubles our assumptions about primitive ancestors. Because the possibility that mythology preserves history makes everything we've dismissed as fantasy suddenly relevant. Whether the wars between Anunnaki and their enemies actually occurred, whether they were metaphors for human conflict, whether they represent cultural memory of natural disasters or technological catastrophes from a forgotten cycle of civilization, the texts themselves are undeniably real, and their message is consistent. The gods fought, the earth shook, and humanity survived to record the memory before it could fade into silence. We return to these texts because they refuse comfortable categorization. They're too detailed to be simple imagination, too consistent across time and geography to be random invention, too technologically sophisticated to represent Bronze Age fantasy, too astronomically precise to emerge from casual stargazing, too historically specific to be pure mythology, yet too extraordinary to be accepted as straightforward history, without questioning our entire understanding of human civilization's development. The Anunnaki narratives persist in popular consciousness despite academic rejection, because they address something fundamental about human experience. We sense our history is deeper than we remember. We recognize that knowledge can be lost, that civilizations can fall, that what seems impossible might once have been commonplace. The texts validate this intuition, suggesting our ancestors witnessed events we've forgotten, possessed knowledge we've lost, existed in a world where boundaries between mythology and history hadn't yet been established because the events being mythologized were still living memory. Modern archaeology tends toward conservatism, requiring extraordinary evidence before accepting extraordinary claims. This is methodologically sound. It prevents wild speculation from replacing rigorous analysis, but it also creates blind spots, areas where anomalous evidence is dismissed rather than investigated, where ancient testimony is discounted rather than seriously considered. The Sumerian texts are anomalous. They don't fit comfortable categories. They describe a world that doesn't match what Bronze Age civilization should have known or experienced. Rather than dismissing them, perhaps we should sit with the discomfort. Allow the text to be strange without explaining away their strangeness. Consider seriously the possibility that the Sumerians meant what they wrote, that they were preserving memory of actual events, actual beings, actual conflicts that shape their world in ways we no longer understand because the framework for understanding has been lost. The consistency is what troubles skeptics most. Hundreds of tablets, dozens of sites, centuries of cultural continuity, all describing Anunnaki descending from heaven, establishing civilization, fighting wars, using advanced technology, creating humans, deploying devastating weapons, reshaping geography through conflicts. If this were invention, you'd expect variation, contradiction, evolution of narrative. Instead, you find remarkable stability. The Anunnaki are always described similarly. Their conflicts follow consistent patterns. Their technology manifests recognizable characteristics. Their relationship with humanity remains stable across textual tradition. This consistency suggests either incredibly successful mythological standardization, maintained across centuries of political upheaval and cultural change, or preservation of information considered so important that changing it was unthinkable. In literate cultures, when everyone can read texts and verify their content, maintaining consistent mythology requires deliberate effort, institutional control, cultural commitment to preserving specific narrative. But if the texts weren't mythology but history, if they recorded actual events that remained culturally foundational, then consistency would emerge naturally from everyone knowing the same basic facts, transmitting the same basic story because it was their story, their origin, their explanation for why the world was the way it was. We're still looking because the questions haven't been answered. The tablets are still being excavated, translated, studied. New archaeological sites are still being discovered. New technologies allow new analyses of old evidence. Every few years, something emerges that complicates the narrative, that suggests our understanding remains incomplete. Perhaps in those untranslated tablets sits the text that would clarify everything. Perhaps in some unexcavated ruin lies the artifact that would prove or disprove the extraordinary claims. Perhaps future archaeology will provide answers that current archaeology cannot. Or perhaps the truth is that we're asking wrong questions, that the binary of myth versus history doesn't capture what these texts represent, that the Sumerians were doing something more sophisticated than either recording events or inventing stories. Perhaps they were preserving something essential about human experience, about civilization's fragility, about the relationship between knowledge and survival, about the importance of remembering even when you no longer fully understand what you're remembering. The Anunnaki conflict narratives remain alive because they touch something true, even if the truth isn't literal historical accuracy. They remind us that civilizations fall, that knowledge is lost, that what seems permanent can be swept away, that humanity has survived catastrophes before and will likely face catastrophes again, that our ancestors witnessed events that shaped them fundamentally, events they considered important enough to preserve in the most durable medium they possessed, pressing warnings and histories into wet clay, baking them in fire, burying them in the foundations of temples and palaces, ensuring that even if everything else was destroyed, even if the cities fell and the languages died and the civilizations turned to dust, the tablets would remain, waiting in the earth, holding the memory of when the gods fought and the earth shook and humanity survived to tell the tale. And so the clay tablets rest in their museum cases now, behind protective glass. Their cuneiform marks still holding questions we're only beginning to answer. The cities lie beneath Iraqi sand, waiting for excavators who may never come, for funding that may never materialize, for a world that might finally be ready to hear what the Sumerians were truly saying. The Anunnaki, whether gods or beings or memories of something we've forgotten, have receded into mythology, leaving only their names pressed into clay and the massive ruins of Ziggurats that still rise from the desert plains like fingers pointing toward a sky they once claimed to touch. 5,000 years is not so long, not really. 100 generations. 100 storytellers passing the tale from grandmother to grandchild, from priest to apprentice. From one set of hands pressing wet clay to another, The Sumerians who recorded these wars believed they were preserving something essential, something that shouldn't be forgotten, even if it couldn't be fully understood. They succeeded. The tablets survived, the stories persist, and we're still here, still listening, still wondering what they witnessed in those former times when the earth was young, and the gods walked among humans and the sky held threats we've since forgotten how to fear. Perhaps that's what matters most. Not whether the Anunnaki were real, not whether the wars actually happened, not whether ancient weapons matched modern technology. Perhaps what matters is that humans have always looked up at the stars and wondered, have always sensed that our history runs deeper than we remember, have always known that knowledge can be lost, that civilizations fall, that what seems impossible might once have been as ordinary as sunrise. The ancient world is not so distant. The same stars the Sumerian astronomers tracked with such mysterious precision still turn overhead tonight. The same questions about where we came from and what we've forgotten still pull at the edges of sleep. You're connected to those ancient scribes across time, part of the same human story of watching, wondering, trying to preserve what matters before the darkness takes it. So let yourself drift now into that comfortable space between waking and dreaming, where the boundaries blur and ancient warnings pressed into clay 5,000 years ago feel as present as your own breath. Rest easy. The tablets are still there, patient as stone, holding their secrets. The ruins still wait beneath the sand, and the questions that brought you here tonight will still be there tomorrow, ancient and patient, ready to pull you back into the mystery whenever you're ready to listen again. Sleep now. The gods have finished fighting, the earth has stopped shaking. And humanity survived to record the memory, just as they always do, just as you will, carrying forward the stories that matter, the questions that persist, the wonder that connects us all across the vast distance of time. Rest.